because I stay up many. My day begins and ends at any time. So because I have to practically do everything, all the planning, all the orders, everything. I've got some very good men. But the point I was trying to make was that if Doe resigns, the vice president resigns, and leave the government as it is in the hands of the legislature with the speaker in charge until we got to move over, that would be a settlement. The chief of staff Dubai leaves the country. The deputy chief of staff can hold whatever portion of the army is left over. That would be fine. There will not be a military council. We want to see democracy. We want to see the ballot box right away. But we want to make absolutely sure that we have control of the situation on the ground before we begin to talk about things that are not possible. We don't want to see a vacuum. I have no intentions of coming in and suspending the entire Constitution. After all, we are coming in with the gun. Our legitimacy will not come from the present Constitution because we're going in with the gun. And so no one expects us to leave the entire Constitution in place because, in fact, we will be an illegitimate government. But what we would do is suspend those portions of the Constitution that have to do with elections that may tend to illegitimize our being in the country. And we're going to go through the normal legal constitutional process and try to build a system and go to the ballot box as soon as possible, because I realize, because I'm not new to this whole process, that in order to get aid and assistance and for, in fact, the American consumption, Congress has its own operation. The administration will be saying one thing, and ultimately the purse is controlled by Congress, and a lot of congressional individuals that have specific interests in Liberia. We want to work along with Congress and for the American people to understand that this is not a bunch of headhunters out here in West Africa trying to shoot up a country for power. I have no interest in that. I just want to talk constructively with the United States and even deepen the relationship with the United States. My education is American education, so let's talk American education. I'm willing to debate anybody, that's plain and simple.
Look 5-10 years into the future, what will Liberia look like?
I hope we can be a real model of democracy in Africa. This is why I talk about a deepening of relationship with the United States. I'm going to try to catch whatever administration there is. Now we're going to start with the Bush administration by the very little parts to really do something. I want more now for less 10 years down the road. I have a background in economics. Why give me rice when I can grow rice? Maybe if you show me and give me the technology to grow rice, you wouldn't have to send me PL 480 rice. Why send me beef from the United States? We can grow cows right out here. Why send me chicken from the United States? If we sit down now and do what's supposed to be done properly, 10 years from now, you probably could reduce foreign aid to Liberia by 50-60%, because that investment would have had a yield tenfold. So 10 years from now, we hope to see a democracy of credibility on this African continent that will serve as a model for other African countries, because I have a problem with a lot of the governments around me. Serious problem with their treatment, their lack of responsibility for human rights, disrespect and regard for individuals. I've been around West Africa here in a few jails, arrested temporarily and left. The jails are deplorable, the people suffer, it's just terrible. So I want Liberia to do what we've always wanted to do over the past 100+ years. And I'm going to need some serious American help. There's going to be no top of the table discussion. We're going to get inside this thing and see what we can do.
Forces 5, Part 1. I am your co-host, Dimitri, and today we are going to dive into the largest and most complex and most scandalous segment of the Demon Forces series so far. Now, we last left off with the brutal capture, torture, and death of Liberian President Samuel Kenyon Doe on September 9th, 1990. And if you've listened to both parts of Demon Forces 4, and if you haven't, I highly recommend that you do, before listening to this, you will remember the intrigues, the mysteries, the coincidences, and the plot surrounding the death of President Doe. And as we've sketched out in this series as exhaustively as I can, this is part of a pattern in Liberian history from the period of the late Cold War onwards, the targeting of a Liberian president who has fallen out of favor with the United States, Liberia's historical big brother. In Demon Forces 2, we covered the assassination and overthrow of President William Tolbert. In Demon Forces 3, while it did not take place in Liberia, we covered the Liberian connections to the assassination of President Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, and we laid out how that was a multifaceted conspiracy between France, the United States, certain Liberian expats, including Charles Taylor and Prince Johnson, and also the president of La Côte d'Ivoire, Felix Houphouet-Boigny, and also his technical son-in-law at that point, and Sankara's right-hand man, Blaise Compaoré, who was involved in the overthrow of Sankara and then himself became president for over 2 decades. Now, it was very important in Demon Forces 4 to really examine all the different factors on the Liberian side to get as firm grounding as we can in this very, very complicated conflict. And as we're going to see today and the next several episodes, this first Liberian Civil War would have to be rated up there with one of the more inscrutable, complicated, multifaceted conflicts in recent memory. Though, as we get deeper into this batch of episodes, you're going to see there are many, many synchronicities to other armed conflicts around the world in the 1990s. In fact, this almost becomes the new template in the post-Cold War environment. And as we are going to see in due time, this is not just sort of a literary similarity or a thematic similarity. There are very real, very ominous, and very far-reaching connections between many of the conflicts that were erupting in the early 1990s. But for today, we are going to mostly stay focused on Liberia and what happens after President Doe is killed and the war metastasizes into a longer-running, intractable conflict with many, many different factions vying for power. Now, I've said this at, I think, the beginning of every single new chapter of Demon Forces, but it does bear repeating that part of the reason I'm going to go through this history with such a fine-tooth comb is because if you read a lot of the mainstream journalistic accounts of this conflict, the academic accounts, certainly a lot of the political commentary that was given at the time and later around the whole thing, there's a lot left to be desired in terms of accurately mapping out the causality and the main forces that were driving this whole thing. There are a lot of different directions that people tend to take it, and throughout this series, I've been trying in my own way to sort of debunk some of the more simplistic narratives, or one could say the more convenient ones, particularly from a Western perspective. This would include all kinds of essentialist presumptions about tribal societies in West Africa and the sort of inevitable nature of ethnic conflict and poverty and disorganization and all manner of excuses that try to put the Liberian conflict in a kind of a neat little box so that we can react to it appropriately. So once again, I am armed with what I think are some of the best sources out there about the First Liberian Civil War, chief among which I'll be citing heavily from again, 2 centuries of U.S. military operations in Liberia, Challenges of Resistance and Compliance by Dr. Niels Hahn, and also something I started reading from in Demon Forces 4, Stephen Ellis's The Mask of Anarchy, The Destruction of Liberia and the Religious Dimension of an African Civil War. In this first part, I'm probably going to be bouncing between these 2 sources. I think that Niels Hahn's, I've said it before, I'll say it again, is far and away probably the strongest book. If I had to recommend a single book to read about the history of Liberia, and particularly the U.S.-Liberian relationship, I would go with 2 centuries of U.S. military operations in Liberia by Niels Hahn. But Ellis's book, The Mask of Anarchy, does provide some very valuable color and a little more of an anthropological kind of lens, and gets into some of also the kind of nitty-gritty personal conflicts and narratives, which, as we're going to see, like in previous chapters, is very important in concert with the kind of broader structural analysis of what went on and the grand geopolitical material incentives and power plays involved. So we have those 2 books, and of course, I've been leaning on it more and more heavily, but the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission from the late 2000s is something I'm going to be splicing in audio from, and this, in fact, is a huge source of Hahn's book, and one of the reasons why it is so good is because it is directly quoting from the testimony of Liberians who were actually there and involved in these things and saw certain things and were given a forum in the late 2000s to proverbially spill the tea and say how things really went down. Last time, I think we got a lot of mileage out of the late, great Emmanuel Boyer, President Doe's information minister and spokesman, essentially. He revealed many interesting things about interacting with the U.S. government and the Bush administration in 1990 as this war was starting. And as we heard in Demon Forces 4, Part 1, on the Liberian delegation to Washington, D.C. in June of 1990, Emmanuel Boyer was party to several very ominous conversations with members of the U.S. government. First with Deputy Secretary of State Larry Eagleburger, who is going to come up down the line in this batch of episodes, and then with a very deep cut as far as deep state actors is concerned, the Deputy National Security Advisor David Charles Miller, who told the Liberian delegation straight up, "You see that phone over there? I could pick it up right now and call Charles Taylor and stop him in his tracks. But we're not going to do that because we're sick of Samuel Doe and we want to get rid of him. And Charles Taylor has the military advantage." He told Emmanuel Boyer and others this in Oliver North's old office in the Executive Office Building, which is certainly thematically appropriate, actually very relevant to what we're going to be getting into. So we already have a little bit of a sense of the U.S. government's double dealing in allowing this conflict. I mean, I'm probably being too generous there by saying allowing, because they were also covertly stoking it, but definitely allowing and seemingly wanting this conflict to explode into an all-out genocidal war that would tear Liberia apart and burn it to the ground. We also had heard in the previous installment from Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Herman Cohen and also former Liberia Ambassador Jim Bishop, who come off as slightly less evil than the whiz kids of the George H.W. Bush administration. But even they point out certain things, like how on the Deputies Committee at the National Security Council, then Deputy NSA Bob Gates, who was formerly Bill Casey's number 2 at the CIA during the Iran-Contra scandal, basically denigrated the U.S.-Liberian relationship as the Cold War was coming to a close and said, essentially, we don't need them anymore, and we shouldn't treat them any different than any other country. We also covered a little bit, and this will we'll come back around to this today, the curious position of the U.S. government on the high-value intelligence installations that they had in Liberia, which were very important to the U.S. during the Cold War. Arguably, one of the most important things about the U.S.-Liberian relationship is that the top-secret U.S. military installations like the Omega navigation system, the VOA, Voice of America transmitter towers, the diplomatic relay station, all remained protected. And part of the reason, I think we could argue, that William Tolbert, the president in the 70s, was assassinated is because he started to pull away in a foreign policy sense from the U.S. and started making certain overtures diplomatically, economically, etc., to various Eastern Bloc communist countries, which Charles Taylor said later on was like a red line. And not long after that, well, he was killed. So that was the lay of the land up until about 1989, when President Doe, after coming to power with full U.S. support, started to get a little bit more paranoid about the U.S.-Liberian relationship, and he started himself making some overtures to countries. In fact, David Charles Miller says, when the Liberians meet him in 1990, that they know that Samuel Doe went and got some second-rate weapons from communist Romania, which at that point, Ceausescu had died about 6 months prior, also in a covert U.S.-backed coup, by the way. And actually, as we'll probably get into the audio of later, certain people saw that as a last straw, that Doe was turning to a communist country for help to get weapons. When the Cold War was almost over, it was obvious that the communists were losing and about to be sort of shoved into the dustbin of history, and that was just a little bit of a step too far. There were other things as well involving Doe's money that we might touch on later, because that sent me down a particular rabbit hole that, like so many other things coming up here in this time period, are just infinitely fascinating and disturbing and weird, and give us a little peek behind the curtain into how the world actually works. Not just West Africa, but the whole world in the 1990s, with the defeat of communism in most of Europe, and then by proxy in South America and Africa in the global South. So we will begin mapping out the situation on the ground in Liberia going into 1991, just so you can get your bearings and understand the different forces at play. And then we're going to start to venture a little bit beyond that. And dear listener, if you thought that the first 4 installments of Demon Forces contained mind-bendingly dark and sinister revelations about how the United States uses its power around the world, you have seen nothing yet. It is about to get very, very sus. So strap yourselves in, because now we are going to take a little trip into Taylorland for Demon Forces 5, Part 1, a celebration of markets. I'm going to start here reading a brief segment from Niels Hahn's book, from Chapter 5, Intensification of the Armed Conflicts, Antagonistic Forces. He says, after the death of President Doe, there was a short struggle for the presidency between Vice President Harry Moniba, General David Nimley, and Prince Johnson. According to the Constitution, the Vice President should become president, However, General Nimley claimed to be the acting president through the National Defense Council, which he had established, while at the same time, Prince Johnson declared himself president of Liberia. There were tensions between Prince Johnson's INPFL and ECOMOG. ECOMOG had refused to launch an attack on the NPFL ordered by Prince Johnson, who therefore arrested more than 60 ECOMOG soldiers. Gaddafi of Libya and President Jerry Rawlings of Ghana had a relatively good relationship, and the U.S. government was concerned about political links between the NPFL and the government of Ghana. Therefore, by the end of September, General Arnold Quainu was replaced by Nigerian Major General Joshua Nimiel Dogonyaro, who was a close friend of Nigerian President Babangida. General Dogonyaro succeeded in uniting the INPFL and the AFL with ECOMOG and launched Operation Liberty in October 1990. Taylor received new military supplies, which improved his military capacity. Several, quote, francophone states in ECOWAS, notably Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire, supported Taylor. Libya had increased support for the NPFL because Gaddafi saw ECOMOG as a dangerous development in Africa. Operation Liberty resulted in weeks of fighting, which destroyed much of the infrastructure in Monrovia and the suburbs, including sewer systems, water supply, and the electricity network. Hundreds of thousands of people fled the country or were housed in internally displaced people camps. By the end of the battle, the NPFL was pushed about 20 kilometers outside of Monrovia. The IGNU, the Interim Government of National Unity, headed by Amos Sawyer, was flown in by ECOMOG and announced itself as the official government of Liberia on November 22, 1990. Sawyer did not trust the AFL and moved his government to the Ducker Hotel, situated close to the U.S. Embassy. His auxiliary force of 1,000 soldiers, named the Black Berets, was trained in Guinea as a special protection force for the IGNU. All the armed factions except for the NPFL accepted the IGNU and Sawyer as the interim head of state. The NPFL established another Liberian government named the National Patriotic Reconstruction Assembly Government, or NPRAG, with its seat in Banga, about 3 hours' drive from Monrovia. Charles Taylor was the elected president of the NPRAG, and the NPFL was referred to as the Army of the NPRAG. The NPFL did not see Sawyer as a puppet of the U.S. because of his leftist orientation. He was seen as a, quote, appropriate man for the U.S. government because Sawyer was a respected academic and politician in West Africa, however, without widespread support from the Liberian population. The U.S. could quickly get rid of Sawyer after he fulfilled the job. In contrast to the IGNU, which only controlled the Monrovia area, NPRAG controlled about 95% of Liberia, which became known as, quote, Greater Liberia, or to other people, Taylorland. Business was established with companies from all over the world, which financed the NPRAG, and the port in Buchanan became strategic for import and export. The economic system of the war economy inspired some scholars to use Liberia as a case study of, quote, shadow economies, clandestine economies, and patrimonial states controlled by, quote, warlords and strongmen. NPRAG favored liberal capitalism and was prepared to do business with companies from all over the world. In particular, French companies became involved in doing business with the NPRAG. According to Lester Hyman, the United States was concerned about the, quote, support that Taylor garnered from Ivorian and French business people because they feared that if he, Taylor, won the presidency, he would, quote, tilt toward the French rather than toward Americans. Now, I'm just going to pause right there and say that we are going to return shortly to the subject of both the shadow economy of Taylorland and also the myriad French connections to all of this. But now I want to switch to Stephen Ellis's The Mask of Anarchy to talk about another major development in late 1990 and going into early 1991 that involves Liberia's neighbor, Sierra Leone, and some new factions that enter the fray. So Ellis writes, under the section New Factions, throughout 1990, Mandingo refugees were fleeing from Liberia to Guinea, which many regarded as their historic homeland, since it was the home of the Malinke people, and to Sierra Leone, where many Krahn refugees had also gathered. Leading Liberian politicians, soldiers, and businessmen in exile immediately began discussing how to organize themselves to get back home. In Conakry, Guinea, Al-Haji Kromah, a professional journalist and one-time information minister, founded an association grandiloquently titled the Movement for the Redemption of Muslims, MRM, on February 21, 1991. Although Kromah was himself married to a Christian woman from a prominent Americo-Liberian family and had been educated at a Catholic school, he hoped that by emphasizing his Muslim religion, he could rally support from Guinea and perhaps finance from the Middle East. His organization's executive committee of 13 consisted of 8 Mandingo and 5 others. He called on Muslims to launch a jihad against the NPFL, which he accused of being anti-Muslim, by reference to its recent persecution of Mandingo. The MRM issued a stream of inflammatory propaganda, claiming that Muslims were the, quote, single most victimized group in the whole conflict, and that the NPFL had burned more than 1,000 mosques and Islamic schools, although Taylor had recently announced full liberty of worship in his territory, Greater Liberia. Kromah could in fact count only a few fighters in his organization. Most Liberian exiles who were disposed to fight the NPFL, including many Mandingo, preferred to join a rival group which was being set up by former AFL personnel, some of whom had had U.S. and Israeli training. The main organizer of this second, more formidable exile group was General Albert Karpeh, a U.S.-trained Special Forces officer, there we go again, and former Minister of Defense in Liberia, who had been Dough's last ambassador to Sierra Leone. On hearing of the RUF-NPFL attack on Sierra Leone on March 23, 1991, General Karpeh, a Krahn, offered his support immediately to the Sierra Leonean government, promising the services of the many AFL veterans and other Liberians now living as refugees in Sierra Leone, many of them Krahn and Mandingo. He called his group the Liberian United Defense Force, or LUDF. Kromah, seeing that Karpeh was attracting significant support, including weapons from the Sierra Leonean government, proposed to join forces with Karpeh and with an organization called the Liberia Peace Council, headed by George Boley, another ex-minister under Dough. Kromah claimed to have far more Mandingo fighters under his command in Guinea than was actually the case, hoping to get himself a leadership position in the new organization, whereas many Mandingo refugees had actually joined Karpeh's new force already. Karpeh and the other Krahn warlords gave Kromah only the post of spokesman in deference to his journalistic skills. Encouraged by the governments in Freetown and Conakry, these elements combined to form the United Liberation Movement for Democracy in Liberia, or ULIMO. The new organization, officially launched in Conakry on May 29, 1991, was a direct result of Karpeh's offer of assistance to the Freetown government some 2 months earlier. While ECOWAS and the NPFL engaged in an endless round of peace negotiations, and Charles Taylor set up his state of Greater Liberia, on the ground in Sierra Leone and Liberia, both sides were developing a war by proxy. The NPFL was acting through the RUF in Sierra Leone, while ULIMO, with support from the Freetown government and the Nigerian army, mounted a sustained offensive against RUF and NPFL forces in company with Sierra Leonean army units. By September 1991, the LUDF wing of ULIMO had re-entered Liberia in some numbers and was getting support from the Nigerian, Sierra Leonean, and Guinean contingents of ECOMOG. Al-Haji Kromah, proclaiming himself to be the leader of the Mandingo element in ULIMO, began using his access to the media to represent himself as the real force behind the organization, much as Taylor had done so successfully when acquiring full control of the NPFL in 1990, and to work at creating an ethnic split within ULIMO calculated to win over to his faction, which was otherwise short of manpower, the considerable number of Mandingo fighters who had hitherto been loyal to a Krahn, General Karpeh. ULIMO's Krahn warlords became irritated by Kromah's self-serving statements. After General Karpeh had complained, some associates of Kromah arranged for Karpeh's murder at his house in Guinea, Sierra Leone, on June 1, 1992, failing narrowly to kill ULIMO's deputy field commander, Roosevelt Johnson, on the same day. Karpeh's murder set off an intense and increasingly violent rivalry between Kromah's faction and the Krahn-led group within ULIMO, each cultivating its own allies in the Sierra Leonean armed forces. In September 1992, a senior Mandingo commander, Major Solomon Kamara, a former tailor and noted soccer player from Nimba County, was killed by the Krahn faction, it is said after refusing a $3,000 bribe to desert Kromah and join the former Karpeh group, in which Roosevelt Johnson was now a rising star. Once more, rival warlords were using ethnic appeals as a means of building support. At stake in this infighting was not only control of a potent military force, since ULIMO had inherited hundreds of trained veterans of Dough's army, but also access to the valuable diamond and hardwood trades, which could be exploited by whomever occupied lands along the Liberia-Sierra Leone border. Roosevelt Johnson, a former Liberian Ministry of Finance official, and some of his Krahn associates had successfully negotiated some diamond deals with French and Lebanese merchants, breaking into a traditional Mandingo trade, and they were paying off the top Sierra Leonean army commanders who were arming them. At the same time, in 1991, the Guinean army began secretly training ULIMO personnel from the Kromah faction at Concon in Guinea. A key intermediary was the Mandingo Al-Haji Kromah, once a diamond dealer in Monrovia, now established at Kissidougou in Guinea. The political, commercial, and military rivalry within ULIMO grew increasingly acrimonious until it produced a public split into two factions in April 1994, one controlled by Kromah and his Mandingo colleagues and generally called ULIMO-K, which had good connections to Guinea, the other Krahn-dominated and known as ULIMO-J from the name of its military commander, Roosevelt Johnson. Mohammed Doumbouya, field commander of ULIMO-K, boasted in a radio interview that he had replaced all the Krahn in his force and had sent them to work on his farm, quote, where they are now my slaves. Now, jumping back to Niels Hahn, because he provides a pretty succinct explanation for why the various actors in this conflict, namely Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Guinea, perhaps also the United States, needed a rebel group like ULIMO to counter Taylor. Hahn writes that ECOMOG's modern military equipment and air force were not equipped for bushfighting. They needed a force like ULIMO to fight in the bush, and there was close cooperation between ECOMOG and ULIMO throughout most of the conflict. According to Herman Cohen, ECOMOG, quote, distributed arms to the IGNU, ULIMO, and AFL. On June 11, 1991, ULIMO gave an ultimatum for Charles Taylor to surrender to ECOMOG or risk being attacked. This marks the beginning of a long military engagement of ULIMO in Liberia. With around 15,000 soldiers, ULIMO became the second largest army in Liberia next to the NPFL. The leadership of all military forces had difficulties controlling their soldiers on the ground. Many soldiers committed atrocities against the civilian population. For example, ECOMOG commanders and soldiers were underpaid. This motivated them to loot and export booty to their own countries. ECOMOG earned the nickname, every car or moving object gone. ECOMOG commanders would also sell arms and ammunition to all factions, including the RUF and the NPFL. The RUF and the NPRAG had a relatively strong support base in West Africa because many people saw them as revolutionary liberation movements against neocolonialism. Many politicians and military officers who were supposed to fight the RUF and NPRAG sympathized with the insurgents and provided covert support. Sierra Leonean government soldiers frequently joined the rebels, which created the term SOBOL, meaning soldier by day and rebel by night. This has confused some Western academics, such as Keane, who describes it as a, quote, shell game and a strangely cooperative conflict. Prince Johnson notes that although the INPFL cooperated with the IGNU and ECOMOG, many INPFL officers were ready to join the NPFL. As the conflicts in Sierra Leone and Liberia grew more complicated, U.S. Congressman and Chairman of the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Mervyn Dimmoly, set up a series of meetings. These meetings were known as the Yamoussoukro Talks 1, 2, 3, and 4, and Jimmy Carter participated. There were so many peace conferences in different African cities under the ECOWAS umbrella that they started numbering them. The common feature of the conferences was that there was always, quote, to be a ceasefire agreement, followed by the formation of an all-party interim government and an election under international supervision. Beforehand, the armies were to encamp their troops and disarm to ECOMOG. The result of the conferences was more or less the same. Taylor would attend and sign the final documents, and then act opposite of the agreement. His fundamental demand was that he, quote, must be the interim president, and insisted that ECOMOG should leave Liberia so negotiations could take place without, quote, outside interference. Jumping back a little bit in the chapter, there's some interesting information here about these conferences. And Hahn writes that the U.S. State Department had sent Ambassador Donald Pedersen to West Africa with a letter for President Houphouet-Boigny to help him understand that, quote, his protege Charles Taylor could not gain power without ECOMOG cooperation, and Taylor was informed that it was, quote, unrealistic to expect ECOMOG to fade away, and he should therefore accept negotiations. NPRAG denounced the IGNU as a, quote, imported government, which became a widespread popular perception in Liberia. The IGNU faced serious problems of legitimacy and was therefore open for negotiations. The peace talks started in Bamako on November 28, 1990, where all the dominant factions were represented. This was followed by a meeting in Banjul on December 20th, where all factions agreed to form a new, quote, future interim government. In a meeting in Lomé on February 13, 1991, the IGNU, NPFL, and NPRAG signed the Lomé Agreement on the cessation of hostilities and peaceful settlement of conflict. This would allow ECOMOG to have significant influence on the peace plan, including the disarmament program. Taylor claimed that he had been pressured by Blaise Compaoré to sign the plan, and NPRAG refused to implement it. The U.S. government encouraged U.S.-based law firm H.B. Goldfield and Lester Hyman and former U.S. President Jimmy Carter to get involved in mediating between the IGNU and NPRAG. Lester Hyman was hired by Taylor to represent NPRAG, and Carter's International Negotiation Network, INN, became instrumental in setting up several conferences for peace negotiations, starting with the All-Liberian Conference in April 1991. Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso did not participate in this conference, and Taylor opted out after receiving information from a foreign intelligence service that the U.S. government had planned to assassinate him during this conference. NPRAG did not believe that ECOMOG, which at that time had increased to 8,000 soldiers, would be able to provide the necessary security, and the meeting took place without Taylor. Before the conference, NPRAG had proposed a three-person Council of National Unity consisting of the NPFL, INPFL, and a, quote, credible Liberian, agreed upon by all factions. However, the result of the All-Liberian Conference was that the IGNU was dissolved and re-established, Sawyer was re-elected as head of the IGNU, and Sawyer then appointed several well-known prominent politicians for office. From the perspective of NPRAG, the All-Liberian Conference did not change anything, and Liberia remained with two de facto governments. Shortly before the All-Liberian Conference took place in March 1991, the RUF invaded Sierra Leone from Liberia. RUF invaded under the leadership of Foday Sankoh and with support from NPRAG, which supplied the RUF with soldiers, food, medicine, arms, and ammunition. Many Krahns who feared retribution from Doe's assault on other ethnic groups in Liberia fled to Sierra Leone and feared that they would be attacked by the joint forces of the RUF and the NPFL. This fear converged with the interests of the government of Sierra Leone that had problems fighting the RUF. With support from the UK and the US, several militia groups were established in Sierra Leone, using Liberian refugees as soldiers to fight the RUF. The government of Sierra Leone promised that services for the Liberian refugees living in the camps in Sierra Leone would improve if the young men would join a militia group. This put immense pressure on the families who depended on humanitarian aid to encourage their young family members to join a militia force. Now I'm going to pause right there because, as you may have noticed, there's a swirl of acronyms, militia groups, personalities, politicians, etc., that are flooding the stage. And in terms of the various factions that are fighting against Charles Taylor, it's only going to get more complicated and convoluted from here on out. We probably will not spend too much time talking about the many peace conferences held around West Africa because, spoiler alert, none of them really amounted to anything significant until probably around 1995, and we are not there yet. But a few interesting things were mentioned in those passages that I just read, and I think to get our bearings properly before we venture any further into the proverbial bush, I think it's helpful to clarify or at least acknowledge the contradictions and complexities of the Liberian Civil War as it stands in early 1991. The first curveball that occurs that complicates everything is that the RUF invades Sierra Leone from Liberia in March 1991. Now, if you remember, we have mentioned the RUF before, I think as far back as Demon Forces 3. They were one of the groups that was training in Libya at the Mataba World Revolutionary Center, and there are a lot of contradictory accounts of when Charles Taylor first made the acquaintance of Foday Sankoh and the RUF leadership. He claims in his war crimes trial very strongly that he didn't know Foday Sankoh at all until the Liberian Civil War had begun. There are several other versions of that, ranging from he knew him from the Libyan training camps. Then there's that story that I had mentioned of when Taylor was, to his surprise, arrested. I think this was in 1988, while President Joseph Momo was out of the country. Taylor was thrown in jail. He was ordered to be flogged. Foday Sankoh stepped forward and offered to take the flogging in his place, and they became fast friends. I'm not sure if that story is true, but I do think it's safe to assume that there was some kind of relationship between the two. And as Hahn stated pretty plainly in his book, the NPFL provided the RUF with material support. Now, whether that was because Charles Taylor held a grudge against President Momo of Sierra Leone and wanted to get revenge for his poor treatment, I'm not so convinced that that is the driving force. That almost smacks of something we're going to see a lot in mainstream accounts of this period is the hyper-personalizing all of Charles Taylor's actions and casting it in a very individualistic psychological way as the machinations of a mad warlord lusting for power. And while that description does, to some extent, apply to Charles Taylor and the people around him, there's a hell of a lot more to look into. And naturally, one of the things that I am most interested in this series is who was supporting Charles Taylor during this entire period. And that's where it starts to get very, very murky. Because you heard me read there in Hahn's book, I think according to Lester Hyman, who actually wrote his own book about Liberia that has some very, very intriguing claims in it, Charles Taylor did not attend one of these peace conferences because he received word from a foreign intelligence service that the U.S. government was planning on assassinating him if he went. Now that might strike you as a little bit contradictory, especially if you're already quite anointed at this point in the series. We've covered Charles Taylor's role in the assassination of Thomas Sankara, which was, at least partially, a covert U.S. plot. And we covered how there seemed to be a certain level of sanction, a quiet sanction in the sense of approval from the George H.W. Bush administration and his National Security Council in 1989 and in the opening months of the war when he invaded, because they wanted to get rid of Doe by any means necessary. But then once Doe is dead and ECOMOG is in control of Monrovia with the IGNU interim government, President Bush and his team seem to be very hostile to the idea of letting Charles Taylor take power and become president of Liberia. This is a little more complicated than your typical Cold War era CIA coup, where the United States government sponsors somebody who takes power and then they have a puppet in power and they support that person. We saw it happen with Samuel Doe in the first 5 or 6 years of his tenure. We saw it with Hissène Habré in Chad. This was the standard playbook, and you might be expecting that to happen now, where the United States allows their boy, who I think we've established pretty well, they broke out of prison in Massachusetts in 1985, to finally go in there and take power, especially because in interviews at the time, Charles Taylor said a lot of things to a lot of people, but he was on the BBC quite often, and he repeatedly emphasized his love of capitalism and his love of the United States, and his hope that the United States would endorse him becoming president of Liberia, almost to the point where it feels like this was a strong expectation of Taylor's going into this whole conflict, that once he got to Monrovia, the United States would allow for him to seize victory. But that's not what happens. Instead, we have the curious breaking away of Prince Johnson and the covert support he starts getting from the U.S. government. And then, to add to that, in the late summer of 1990, before Doe dies, you have the creation and the arrival of the ECOMOG West African Peacekeeping Force, which multiple people had said. I think Prince Johnson said at the TRC that everybody knew that ECOMOG was made in the USA, and Doe, President Doe, in some of his final meetings with both Prince Johnson and with ECOMOG Commander General Arnold Quenu on the day he was to be captured, was going on rants about how ECOMOG was a CIA plot. So if you lay all that out, what you appear to have is the Charles Taylor faction, the NPFL, getting certain types of support from the U.S. government, although very, very quietly, and I think in a lot of cases covertly. Then, on the public side of things, you have the United States speaking of Taylor as a Gaddafi-trained thug who's dangerous and somebody that they do not want to even be seen having an association with. I think Jim Bishop, the former Liberian ambassador and no stranger to covert ops, said that he was told that they were going to pull back from Liberia and not intervene because the United States government did not want to have any moral responsibility for Charles Taylor becoming the next president of Liberia. So in a sense, the picture that starts to emerge is that the U.S. government is, on one level or another, backing every faction in this conflict simultaneously, almost playing them against each other. But we can't just talk about the U.S. government in all this, because there is another relatively powerful foreign country that has its fingerprints all over what's going on in Liberia. And that is, of course, France, a country that has very close neo-colonial relationships with La Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso, the two largest local sponsors of Charles Taylor. Now, I'm going to play a little bit from the TRC because there's an excerpt that addresses this quite well. And this is from a guy that we've mentioned a couple times, but we haven't heard him yet. This is Dr. Henry Boima Fahnbulleh, or as he's better known, H. Boima Fahnbulleh. And this is what he says about a variety of things we've discussed already, including President Houphouet-Boigny of La Côte d'Ivoire, his goddaughter, the wife of A. Benedict Tolbert, who was murdered by Doe, and the intersections of international intrigue and personal power politics.
Thank you. Now, against the backdrop of what has been said, and I have reference to what you referred to earlier, but Herman Cohen, former Assistant Secretary of State, against the background of what he said during the TRC hearings in the U.S., would you opine that the involvement of Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire in the Liberian crisis somehow received the tacit approbation of the U.S.?
Let me say, you know, the late Ahmed Sékou Touré had said to us, A.B. Tolbert had been killed together with Vanny Sherman after the execution of Thomas Wesen. I had taken over the foreign ministry after Marcus Matthews. And Samuel Doe sent Podia and myself to Guinea to go and explain to Sékou Touré that the late Wesen had killed A.B. Tolbert. Our delegation got to Guinea and they took us to the Palace de Peuple. Of course, Ahmed Sékou Touré, widely read, he understood so much. The first thing he brought up, he said, I noticed that your students are agitated. And the late Podia said, the students are troublemakers. Ahmed Sékou Touré said, no. When you took power, the students were rejoicing. If today they have turned against you, it's because you have changed. Students don't change, not until they leave college. You have to examine yourself. Podia then said, Head of State Doe wants me to tell you that the late Wesen, the Vice Head of State, executed A.B. Tolbert. Secretary said to him, Secretary said, Houphouet is not a man who forgives easily. He said when A.B. Tolbert was arrested from the French embassy and put in prison, Houphouet-Boigny sent to me to ask me to intercede with Doe to free A.B. Tolbert. Secretary said, I sent my Prime Minister, Lassana Biagogi, to Doe. Doe said to me, there was no problem. A.B. Tolbert was all right. He will go to trial. A couple of months later, the news got to French intelligence that A.B. Tolbert had been executed. French intelligence then informed President Houphouet-Boigny. Houphouet-Boigny again sent to President Touré. He said, I've learned that A.B. Tolbert has been killed. Secretary said, I sent Biagogi again to Head of State Doe. Head of State Doe said it was not true. Now you have come to me to tell President Houphouet-Boigny that A.B. Tolbert was killed by the late Wesen. And Secretary said, Wesen is dead, he cannot defend himself. But I can tell you one thing. We all have to die and answer to our makers. But Houphouet-Boigny, knowing him as I do, he will not forgive you. And so yes, when Houphouet realized that there was a group willing to overthrow Samuel Doe, and it was stated at the Hague trial by one of the leading members of the NPFL that they were giving arms. While waiting for Libyan arms, they were giving arms by the Ivorian Defense Ministry. Of course, Houphouet-Boigny knew. And because of Houphouet-Boigny's connection in Paris, it is possible that he convinced the French. The French were heavily involved. He convinced the French that Taylor should be helped. We have information from our sources that the son of the president of France, of President Mitterrand, was in contact with the Taylor people. So obviously Burkina Faso, Blaise Compaoré will only be courageous to send 700 to 1,000 soldiers into Liberia if he had the tacit endorsement of the French to Houphouet-Boigny. Yes, now it's just possible that the French, knowing that they were going to support Mr. Taylor, knowing the connection of Houphouet-Boigny to Mr. Taylor and his group, and also Blaise Compaoré, it is just possible that they could have sent the signal to the Americans that we can handle this. We can handle this. And that was the problem the Nigerians had. Because the Nigerians had the potential, they had the capacity to destroy the NPFL. They were stopped at every step of the way. And they kept saying to themselves, what is happening about Liberia? Why do we find it so difficult to get a consensus to move in with full force and stop this war? Arms were coming through the Ivory Coast. So if you like, at a particular stage, because of the involvement of Houphouet-Boigny, because of other international actors, this whole internal rebellion became a vast international conspiracy to help the Taylor people to stop searching other forces who were perceived to be anti-whatever. So yes, I think, and I must appreciate what Mr. Cohen said to you people in America. He knows, he has seen the records, but we can only conjecture that there was a desire by certain international actors to ensure that Mr. Taylor took power in Liberia, irrespective of the fact that he was coming from Libya, which was a barrier state, with all its values antithetical to the values of certain international partners or actors. So yes, I believe that sincerely. And so obviously at the end, Mr. Taylor was given the presidency. But like all historical mirages, Mr. Taylor ended the way he did. He ended the way he did. Because this society is complex.
In just a few minutes there, H. Boima Fahnbulleh, I think, quite eloquently sums up all of the bizarre contradictions and mysteries surrounding the eruption of this war. And you heard him say it, that the personal grudge held by President Houphouet-Boigny of Ivory Coast after President Doe pretty much went behind his back and murdered his son-in-law may have opened a door of opportunity that might not have been there otherwise. And Fahnbulleh believes it's likely that through his extensive contacts in Paris, Houphouet-Boigny convinced the French and brought them on board into this entire Liberian destabilization plot. You also heard him say something that is very intriguing, which is the frustration of the Nigerians who, on the surface, were fully backed enthusiastically by the U.S. government and the Bush administration. Remember, because the U.S. kind of held up ECOMOG as a, quote, African solution to an African problem, and Hahn notes that it sort of jived quite nicely with Bush's optimistic vision for a, quote, new world order that he articulated on September 11th, 1990, in his address to Congress, just about 24 hours after Doe was killed. And I think there is something to that. I think this did herald the inauguration of a new approach for the post-Cold War era. Now, if you remember back to Demon Forces 4, when I went on quite a long tangent about Chad and France, remember I read the State Department oral history interview with former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under Reagan, Chet Crocker, and he talked a lot about the amazing cooperation that the French and the Americans had in the 1980s. He talked about the French concept of the chasse gardée in its West African former colonies, and Chet Crocker kind of poured a little cold water on the idea that the United States and French interests are necessarily antagonistic in places like Africa. On the contrary, he was beaming about the amazing cooperation they had in Chad when, to paraphrase Bill Casey, they bloodied Gaddafi's nose on the Aouzou Strip in that conflict in the mid-'80s. And you may also remember in Demon Forces 4, when I was reading from Ellis's The Mask of Anarchy, he mentioned that after the Toyota War of 1987, which the U.S. was heavily involved in, Gaddafi, for one, wanted to seek revenge in the United States, and he saw Liberia, the nerve center of U.S. intelligence in West Africa, as a prime target. Ellis also mentioned in that section that Gaddafi's relationship with the French started to take a little bit of a turn in the midst of that Chad-Libya war, and he realized that he should make some kind of rapprochement with them, perhaps. And I speculated, though I really can't be sure, that that may have been a route by which Gaddafi was sort of lured into at least not opposing the assassination plot against Thomas Sankara, somebody who he had previously supported, and honestly, one of the bright lights of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, certainly in comparison to Foday Sankoh and Charles Taylor. So these relationships between Libya, France, the United States, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, are worth looking into a little bit deeper. Now, there's another piece of testimony that perhaps sheds a little bit of light on this whole French situation, and that is from Charles Gonke Taylor himself at his war crimes trial. This is from, I think, the third day that he was testifying. For some reason, it is the last day that I am able to find actual video of it anywhere on the internet. For some reason, the first 3 days are all there. They're on YouTube. You can find them easily. But then it just drops off after that, even though I know from seeing video clips way further in the trial that they did video record the whole thing. Anyways, not to get sidetracked, but it seems to have been wiped pretty thoroughly from the internet. So after this segment you're going to hear, I'm going to have to resort to reading from transcripts. But luckily, we have Charles Taylor to talk about that pre-revolutionary period in La Côte d'Ivoire and a couple of the people that provided important assistance to him and worked with him in setting up this rebellion. The first he's going to talk about at length is a very important figure down the road, and one that we will kind of examine more at a later date in great detail. But that is the future president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf. And then Taylor goes on to talk about a much more obscure figure, somebody who barely at all pops up in these books that I've been reading from, but somebody that needs to be cited as a factor in all of this. So here's what Taylor had to say. And when you listen to him, of course, always a grain of salt, especially because in this context, Taylor is on trial and facing effectively a life sentence in prison, but also try to listen between the lines of what he's saying, because I think throughout his testimony, he's making a number of veiled allusions, one could say maybe swipes, at various figures who, in his telling, were much more entangled with Charles Taylor than they would later let on.
Mr. Taylor, just before lunch, I rather prematurely placed before you a map. But before we come to the map, I think we need to lay a bit more groundwork. Upon your release, following that second incarceration in Ghana, did you travel anywhere outside Africa?
After my release from Ghana, I went straight to Ivory Coast. Then I went to Burkina Faso, verified my trip I went into Libya to see the situation of the men, returned, and then before I went to France.
Why did you go to France?
I did not put the second NPFL together alone. This second NPFL was put together by those of us. I remember saying to the court, there was a group in La Côte d'Ivoire. Now, working along with us in La Côte d'Ivoire was a gentleman called Tonya King.
Pause there, please. How do you spell the first name?
Tonya. T-O is the dividing. T-O-N-Y-I-A. I want to believe. If it's wrong, we can correct it another day. Working with me outside, and may I just emphasize, Tonya went along for some time, but once the Libyan connection was cemented, Tonya broke away from us. He no longer participated, but two others remain. There's a gentleman called Tom Wuyu. We mentioned that on yesterday. That's W-O-W-E-I-Y-U. And the present president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf. The three of us finally were the individuals that put the NPFL together. So upon leaving Ghana, I had traveled to Paris to meet with Ellen Johnson and Tom Wuyu in Paris.
And when you say that the current president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, was one of the organizers, in what way did she assist?
Oh, Ellen is a whole revolutionary. She's been involved in, she was involved in part with the first NPFL. That was not new to Ellen.
Which first NPFL?
I remember I told the court that the first invasion into Liberia that was launched by General Kurumba was called the NPFL. And this second, or maybe it's better to say this continuation of the NPFL, Ellen was also a very good part of it, because Ellen was also a very close friend of General Kurumba.
So she was involved in the Kiwampa coup?
Well, I am, when you hear me say she was involved, I will not be able to give you all of the details, because I'm sure that, from the prosecution questions will come. I was out, but I know she was close to Kurumba, and the extent of her involvement, if I'm pressed on this, I wouldn't be able to give you the extent, but I do know she was associated with Kurumba. She associated with the training outside where she knew about it, okay, and she knew about ours. But in my case, she was really involved in helping me financially.
Financially how?
Oh, Ellen raised money throughout while the training was going on. In fact, I had taken the first two picture groups to her in Paris. She had then moved to the United States.
The first two what?
Picture groups. The first group, remember I mentioned here just before the break that the trainees went into groups. The first two groups had gone, and I did mention that in the second group was Moses Blah. We had pictures of these combatants. So I flew into Paris. We met at Orly Airport, in fact, at the Holiday Inn Hotel at Orly Airport, where I was. She came and I showed her the two sets of pictures. She was very, very pleased. And then this was really to convince her that her efforts were not being wasted in what she was doing. And by that I mean she was doing two things. Ellen raised most of the money that we needed for all of this movement in the early stage, and even during combat. And secondly, I now cannot go back to the United States. She is, if I'm not mistaken, is working with a bank somewhere in the Washington, D.C. area and has tremendous contacts. So we use Ellen to do our so-called diplomatic contacts outside and to raise money.
Now, another name you mentioned was Tom Wuiyu.
That is correct.
Do you recall telling us that he was a member of the union, ULAA?
That is correct.
And when did you first come across him?
Oh, I first met Tom in the early 70s, around 1972.
Where?
In the United States when I arrived, and this process of trying to put together the different organizations that I explained to the court in different parts of the United States. Tom was stationed in the state of New Jersey, one of the largest chapters of the union, and was very influential in working with different groups in the New York, New Jersey area.
Now, did he remain in the United States during this period we're concerned with now, when you're traveling around West Africa to put the NPFL together?
No. Tom made several trips to West Africa even before the men were moved to Libya. He made several trips. We were in and going through the organizational phase of this, so he made several trips during the organizational phase. Ellen did not come to West Africa to see me during this phase of putting men together. She was busy in Washington. But, Tom was in direct contact with her, and whatever little funds she could raise, he would bring it down. We moved to Libya. Tom is still coming in and out. He goes to Libya many, many times, even when I can't be there, because I do not live in Libya. I want to visit the camp, maybe for a day or two, live at the Mataba, come back. Tom is moving up and down, but Ellen doesn't come.
Now, so we've dealt with Tom Wuiyu. I just want to ask you a little bit more, please, about Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf. When did you first met her?
Oh, Ellen. Ellen was in Liberia during the coup years of 1980. Ellen was there. Ellen had an apartment at a penthouse on Broad Street at top of the Ministry of Education building. So she was there. She went and came and became very friendly, and very, very friendly.
With who?
With General Thomas Kurumpa.
And what about you? Were you friends with her?
Oh yes, I knew Ellen at that time, exactly. Because Kurumpa went nowhere almost without me, of course. We got to know each other then.
Yes. My question is very simple. Were you friends with her?
Well, I would say yes, because she was very close to my friend General Kurumpa, so we became friends.
And what about Johnson-Sirleaf's relationship with Doe?
No, to the best of my recollection, Ellen really never got along with Doe.
And what happened to Ellen after the October 1985 elections in Liberia?
Oh, to the best of my recollection, I think Ellen was arrested.
By whom?
By Samuel Doe, who was the president. And I understand that she managed to get out, I don't know how, of Liberia, and she was saved by some mutual friends. It is believed that she was helped by a gentleman, a very good friend of hers, or at least I hope they are still friends, called Gabriel Doe. I understand assisted in getting her out of the country when she got out of prison.
Now, so putting all of this together, Who were the main people in putting together this second NPFL?
Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, Charles Gonke Taylor, and Thomas Wowoyu. Finally.
Were there others involved in an organizational capacity?
Not really. I just mentioned to the court that there were others that dropped, including the gentleman I mentioned, Tonya King. He dropped aside because he just wouldn't go to Libya. He was just frightened. He wouldn't go there. We're talking about the Cold War period, and that name Libya was almost like Black Snake. We appreciated Libya for what they were doing, supporting the whole Pan-African idea. So we were not frightened to be labeled whatever they wanted to call us.
Now, Tonya King, what was his background?
Tonya King is married to the daughter of the late President William Ira Tolbert, that we discussed here, that was killed in the coup d'etat by Doe. And immediately thereafter, he settled in La Côte d'Ivoire.
Now, was Tonya King in a position to provide any particular assistance to those seeking to put together the NPFL?
Oh, definitely. Tonya assisted in providing little food, the contact. He's in La Côte d'Ivoire living with his wife. He's known by all of the senior people in the Ivorian establishment. Why? Remember I spoke about Daisy being married to A.B. Tolbert, the son of the late William Ira Tolbert, whose sister is married now to Tonya King. So there is sympathy in the establishment for that family in total. And so he helps substantially. He helps in whatever way he can. And I'm saying to you, he breaks away at the Libyan part that apparently he just couldn't take, I guess.
Apart from contacts with the Ivorian establishment, did he have any other contacts in Côte d'Ivoire?
Yes, of course. Tonya had been a very... He was trained in the intelligence field. In fact, at the time of the coup d'etat in Liberia, Tonya is what we call Commissioner of Immigration and Naturalization, which is a part of the security establishment. He had good friends among the British and American embassies in Ivory Coast. He had very good contacts.
Contacts with whom within those embassies?
Of course, the officials, the ambassador, the intelligence people. He knew all of them.
Intelligence people like who?
I don't know the names of the individuals, but when we talk about intelligence from the United States, especially external intelligence, we're talking about what? The Central Intelligence people. He did not introduce us to them because he's an intelligence officer, but he had extensive contacts with them.
And was that of assistance to the NPFL?
Well, I didn't ask Tonya where he got his little money from, but he assisted with little funds and meals, and things were just made easy for us. Remember now, moving people across West Africa, from Ivory Coast to Burkina Faso to Libya, there was no leakage anywhere. No one, nowhere, anywhere on this planet knew at that particular time that Charles Taylor was training people in Libya. So I must assume that those connections were used very well because we moved people throughout that region. We got travel documents for them. So Tonya used his links very well.
So there you have it. There are a few things I want to flag there real quick, just about what he says about Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf. First of all, it's worth noting that for many years, I think we even stumbled across this line in the Mask of Anarchy last time, that for years Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf insisted that she only ever provided, quote, moral support to the NPFL in the very earliest stages of the rebellion, but quickly figured out that Taylor was a bad guy. To quote Prince Johnson, a scary man, and she broke with him. So this is a little bit of a bombshell when Taylor said this at his trial, and now it's pretty widely acknowledged that she did funnel money to Charles Taylor in this pre-revolutionary period. Another thing I want to flag is that she was arrested by Samuel Doe after the failed Quyanqba coup in 1985. You notice there that Taylor makes a point of noting that she was saved by a close friend, Gabriel Doe. I'm pretty sure no relation to Samuel Doe. But wait, where have we heard that name before? Gabriel Doe. If you remember back to Demon Forces 2, when I stumbled upon that State Department cable, I think it was written by then Ambassador Manful, the sort of notorious and ominous Steve Saw Red memo about Finance Minister Stephen Tolbert, the president's brother, and how he had been engaged in a bitter feud with this amazing Liberian businessman named Gabriel Doe that the ambassador seemed to be gushing over, almost to the point where it was suspicious, and how they had been engaged in a dispute over a mutual girlfriend. And when Stephen Tolbert found out that Gabriel Doe was seeing this girl, Steve saw red and noted that business interests in America that were interested in doing business in Liberia should be notified by the State Department that the Tolberts have taken out a doe hunting license. And just by the tone of that cable, that was also, I think, just a week or two or days before Stephen Tolbert's plane mysteriously crashed off of the coast of Liberia while he was in the middle of very heated negotiations with the Firestone Rubber Company about renegotiating their 99-year lease in Liberia. Something that President Tolbert, based on the other cable traffic, definitely suspected was a CIA assassination. So, putting all that together, it seems like maybe Gabriel Doe was a little bit more than just a successful Liberian businessman with excellent American contacts. And then, about 10 years later, he saves Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf from possible execution for taking part in her friend Thomas Quyanqba's failed coup. And after that, Ellen comes back to the United States, and not long after that, becomes entangled with Charles Taylor. Now, last thing I'll flag about Ellen is that Taylor mentions that she was working with a bank in the Washington, D.C. area. We're going to return to that a little bit later, because I might have an idea as to which bank he's referring to. But moving on to the second part of that clip, he talks a little bit about the mysterious Tonya King. And wouldn't you have it, Tonya King isn't just some Liberian, he is an in-law of the Tolbert clan. He married one of President Tolbert's daughters. So now, we've talked before about Daisy Delafosse Tolbert, the wife of A.B. Tolbert, and the sort of pivotal role that that whole saga played in getting Houphouet-Boigny of Ivory Coast to support an insurgency against Samuel Doe. Samuel Doe basically killed his son-in-law. But as it turns out, that's not the only Tolbert connection to all of this, because one of Tolbert's daughters was married to this government official named Tonya King, who escaped to Cote d'Ivoire and set up shop there, and, as Taylor says, had a background in the intelligence field. So between Daisy Delafosse Tolbert Compare and Tonya King, married into the Tolbert clan, this kind of picture starts to emerge of the surviving Tolberts being very busy in the Liberian exile community, both in West Africa and the United States. in the 1980s. And it's not hard to see why. The patriarch of the family and the star of the next generation, A.B. Tolbert, were both murdered by Samuel Doe in a very savage and brutal fashion, and they were ejected from their seat of power pretty completely by the new PRC regime. I know before that I've compared the Tolberts to the Kennedys, and I think there are a lot of strong similarities there, but this is sort of like if Ted Kennedy started plotting an armed insurrection in the late 1970s to settle the scores of his two brothers being murdered. The other interesting things about Tonya King, that Taylor says, is that he, quote, dropped off around the time that they started to go train in Libya, which is interesting. He was fully in support of them, but there was something about the Libya situation that scared him that he just couldn't take. Now, Taylor also said that he had excellent intelligence contacts with the British and American embassies in La Côte d'Ivoire, and Taylor presumes that he used those contacts very well in helping the NPFL in certain ways, even when they were doing the Libya thing. I mean, there's an interesting contradiction there. I think, pretty sure that Taylor says at another point, he clarifies about Tonya King, that Tonya King still broadly supported their aims. He just was afraid himself of going to Libya and being seen as being involved with Libya.
You spoke of a split with Tonya King over the Libyan connection. Was Tonya King...
Excuse me, but I think that mischaracterizes what the witness said. He didn't talk about a split. He talked about Mr. King being afraid to go to Libya.
Yes,
Very well.
Okay, but I can clarify that.
Well, can you help us then,
Yes.
please, Mr. Taylor?
I think Counsel is right. Tonya is with me all the way, but he just would not travel to Libya. He was afraid. And again, we are in this period of the Cold War, and Libya is not the type of word that anybody wants to hear. And just to, I don't want to use the word speculate because the court doesn't accept that, but my own guess, I'll put it this way, is that Tonya has intelligence connections, and maybe it's good that he didn't go, because his connections with the diplomatic committee in Ivory Coast just might have exposed him. But he did not go, and so I got upset and felt that if we had put men together to send for training and he was not prepared to visit them as Tom had visited them, and it's not like in Ellen, who was in the United States and by coming would have probably burned her track, they would have gotten to know. But being right in West Africa, if he didn't go, then we had to drop him, and we dropped him.
And I just feel like that syncs up very well with this idea of Tonya King essentially being an intelligence officer, though not officially because he was out of the government at that point, but a sort of freelance intelligence officer, possibly liaising with specifically the Americans. I think that if the CIA had a contact that was interfacing with the NPFL on the ground in West Africa, Tonya King is probably the number one candidate of that go-between. And so it would make sense that as a liaison to the American intelligence services, that he himself, especially being from the Tolbert clan, where two major members of that family were, I think, you could reasonably say, murdered for their perceived hostility to American interests, it would make sense that a Tolbert in-law such as Tonya King might be afraid of crossing that Rubicon and going to Libya himself and being perceived. Remember, this is like 1987, 1988, around the time of the Toyota War. To be perceived as a friend of Libya is something perhaps that Tonya King was street smart enough to avoid. he didn't want himself to be tainted by that. But at the same time, Taylor says that he assumes Tonya made things very easy for them because not a single person on the earth, nobody knew that Charles Taylor was training Liberians in Libya. So there's an interesting little contradiction there where if Tonya King really turned his back on the NPFL because of this horrible Libya thing, then he still seemed to be using his contacts with the Americans and the British and others, and probably presumably the French too, to kind of signal to the Americans, don't worry, we can handle this. Just help us keep it a secret from Samuel Doe. And that brings to mind something else that I read last time in Chet Crocker's oral history about his time in the State Department. He talked about the interactions between French and American officials in Africa and how oftentimes they would find that their interests would align on certain things and they could work quite well together. But he also said that it wasn't the United States' desire to inherit all of the French responsibilities of their kind of neo-colonial relationships across Africa. And in fact, he said at one point that it could be kind of helpful to take turns dealing with certain issues. I think he said at one point that sometimes there are issues that are smelly and look bad for America to be getting involved in. And I think he said something along the lines of, when we're asked to deal with, say, the human rights situation in Togo, and we look around and say, ugh, this certainly doesn't pass the smell test. Why don't we let you handle that one, Francois? I keep coming back to that line. Why don't we let you handle that one, Francois? Because it kind of syncs up with what Boima Fahnbulleh said. His assertion that Houphouet-Boigny convinced the French to get behind the NPFL insurrection, and the French then turned to the Americans and said, don't worry, we can handle this. Another strange thing about Tonya King is that after this war period really kicks off, Tonya King seemingly disappears into the ether. There's very little information about him besides what Charles Taylor said at his war crimes trial. And I tried very hard to find any information. Just like with Celly Thompson, he gave an interview many years later talking about the overthrow of Doe, where he said that Doe was a CIA agent, etc. But there really wasn't anything. I was able to find in the records of the TRC that Tonya King was actually scheduled to testify, but then there is no transcript, there's no video, there's no summary of him actually testifying. So it's unclear, maybe he didn't show up, or maybe his testimony was given in private. But one thing I did notice in the final summary of the report, they gave a list of Liberians that they recommended should be barred from holding political office ever again. And wouldn't you know it, Tonya King was on that list. The only other thing I could find about Tonya King is that there was an academic dissertation that was published in 2019 by somebody who is, I think, now a professor at a university in Texas. And the subject of this dissertation, I think, was about Marcus Garvey's Pan-Africanist efforts in Liberia and also corresponding communities in the United States that were promoting a kind of similar ideology in the early 20th century. And one of the interview sources that was cited by this academic was an individual named Tonya King, who was interviewed in 2019. I went so far as to email this professor and ask them if the Tonya King they interviewed was in fact the Tonya King. And I haven't gotten a response, so we can't say. But if that is Tonya King, then I think they're living a nice, quiet life in the United States today. But circling back now to the question of shadow economies and French connections, I'm going to read a little bit more from Ellis here. This is under the section Greater and Lesser Liberia. After Doe's murder in the early hours of September 10, 1990, the ECOMOG force commander, General Quainu, retired to be replaced at the head of the international force by Nigerian Major General Joshua Dogonyaro. The new commander acted with exemplary decisiveness. He secured control of Monrovia and, having been attacked by the NPFL, he used aircraft and artillery to force Taylor's forces out of the city. For the first time, Taylor began to favor diplomatic activity in preference to military action, in an attempt to freeze the situation on the ground. Within Monrovia, Dogonyaro presided over the installation of the interim government of national unity, a puppet government of Liberian politicians under Professor Amos Sawyer, and succeeded in disarming Prince Johnson's INPFL and getting the remnants of Doe's armed forces of Liberia back to barracks. The Nigerian general encouraged international aid organizations to return to Monrovia and feed its population, repaired the essential infrastructure, and cleaned up the corpses littering the streets. Appreciating the value of the media, for the first time he was able to contest Taylor's dominance of the airwaves. But the Nigerian government recalled Dogonyaro on February 27, 1991. Why the Nigerian government withdrew Dogonyaro when he was making such clear military progress remains unclear. Possibly it believed that a more conciliatory field commander could negotiate peace with Taylor. More probably, President Babangida, strongly opposed to Taylor, realized that a negotiated peace was most likely to result in confirmation of his enemy as president of Liberia. But at the same time, Babangida was unwilling to launch Nigerian and ECOMOG forces on a full-scale military campaign to defeat the NPFL. Moreover, Babangida was not immune from the tendency of so many West African presidents who, having taken power by force, can hardly afford any of their subordinates to build potential power bases of their own, such as Dogonyaro might have done had he been allowed to proceed with a successful campaign in Liberia. Babangida's compromise solution was to hold Monrovia and support the puppet IGNU government while negotiating a ceasefire with the NPFL in an attempt to calm the situation, from which position ECOMOG could work at weakening the NPFL over the longer term. There were already signs that some Nigerian officers were developing vested interest in staying in Monrovia for a long time. Dogonyaro's successive Nigerian replacements as ECOMOG field commander, both military engineers rather than infantrymen, followed a policy of mediation, decreeing a ceasefire, visiting Taylor in his own territory, and even trading with the NPFL. A torturous round of international diplomacy now replaced fighting as the chief means by which the warring parties struggled for advantage. Charles Taylor, enraged by ECOMOG for denying him the military victory which had been within his grasp, adapted quickly to the situation by setting up a parallel government in the area under his control, which he called Greater Liberia. Monrovia housed the rump of the Liberian state, nominally under Sawyer's interim government. Officials in Monrovia continued to go about their work as best they could, while the real power lay with ECOMOG, and particularly the Nigerian contingent. Only in Grand Jeddah County, home territory of the Krahn, was there persistent fighting as the NPFL faced a locally based resistance movement. While Taylor was waiting to make a final assault on Monrovia, he was building an impressive personal fief. All roads in NPFL territory, the greater part of Liberia, were sealed with numerous checkpoints where travelers were liable to be stopped and interrogated and have their goods looted by those on duty. Many Monrovians derive some of their worst memories of the war from the period in mid to late 1990 when the NPFL was establishing itself outside the city. All over its territory, the NPFL set up checkpoints known as gates along the road, usually consisting of a piece of rope stretched between two poles, manned by gun-toting NPFL fighters, sometimes no more than children. Often these checkpoints were decorated with ghastly trophies such as human skulls. The most notorious gates acquired sinister nicknames. The U.S. Embassy estimated that at one NPFL checkpoint, known as No Return, no fewer than 2,000 people were killed in the course of 1990, their bodies often remaining unburied in the surrounding bush. No one would touch them for fear of being considered a government collaborator. The few travelers who could move freely were Gio and Mano people, overwhelmingly supporters of the NPFL, who soon acquired control of local trade. Taylor, although consumed more than ever by an ambition to become president of Liberia, learned rapidly that there were significant advantages in being the leader of an unofficial Greater Liberia. He had developed relations with leading Ivorian, French, and Lebanese business people in Abidjan before the war, and once he had taken control of the port of Buchanan in May 1990, he discovered that these and other traders were not averse to doing business with the new Liberian strongman. For those with established interests in Liberia, such as the rubber company Firestone or the Liberian Minerals Company, which ran the iron ore mines in Nimba County, it was imperative to restart production and export their products. Since the NPFL now controlled virtually the whole country outside Monrovia, they had every incentive to deal with Taylor. Newer arrivals, particularly in the logging business, also discovered the attractions of the NPFL. Taylor proved himself a shrewd negotiator who liked to discuss matters personally with leading foreign business people, which meant a minimum of time-wasting bureaucracy. He would grant a license to operate in return for personal payment of tax in US dollars. With the income from their business deals, Taylor was able to procure weapons from the former Warsaw Pact countries, where arms of all sorts could be got for bargain prices, which he imported through Côte d'Ivoire and via Burkina Faso. He was free to use his money for military purposes or to mediate political relationships, while he kept the balance in accounts in Abidjan, Ouagadougou, and elsewhere. Sometimes Taylor would ask his foreign business partners to write out checks to pay various bills or to perform other services on behalf of the NPFL in lieu of taxes. Many of Taylor's business managers lived in Abidjan, where they held regular gatherings at a well-known restaurant, La Maison Blanche. One was a leading arms purchaser, another a timber magnate exporting through the Ivorian port of San Pedro. A third was Taylor's main legal advisor, a son of the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Liberia, one of those executed by Doe in April 1980. From late 1990, Taylor was able to generate a vast income by his control of Greater Liberia, despite the fact that it was a state unrecognized by the international community. U.S. Ambassador William Twaddle, testifying to the Africa Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives in 1996, reckoned that between 1990 and 1994, Liberia's diamond exports averaged $300 million per year, timber exports $53 million, rubber exports $27 million, and gold exports $1 million. Iron ore exported during 1990 to 93 averaged $41 million annually. Taking these figures into account, he estimated that, quote, Charles Taylor, who has long controlled the most lucrative areas of the countryside, could have upwards of $75 million a year passing through his hands as a result of taxes levied on these trades. The finance and justice ministers in the interim government of Monrovia estimated Taylor's income at over $100 million a year. It is notable that these figures did not include the income from marijuana, grown in northern Liberia and exported in containers via Buchanan and the Ivorian port of San Pedro. Meanwhile, the interim government headed by Professor Sawyer, the only one which had some formal international recognition, was heir of debts up to $3 billion, which it had to manage with a paltry income of little more than perhaps $20 million per year, 3/4 of which was derived from fees paid on the international fleet of Liberian registered ships. More on that later. Taylor's great wealth enabled him to pay salaries to some of his military commanders and to distribute cars and other largesse to senior officials in the area he called Greater Liberia, but most of his soldiers had to survive on bribes and plunder. Taylor was shrewd enough to seek the support of clan chiefs and other local leaders where possible, so that daily life continued with some degree of normality in much of his territory after the disruption caused by the first months of war. A senior Senegalese politician who visited Greater Liberia in October 1990 thought it well organized. Some foreign businessmen operating in Taylor's Greater Liberia in 1991 thought conditions better than they had been for a number of years. In interviews, foreign businessmen recalled almost nostalgically how they could sort out problems by going straight to the local NPFL army commander or military police commander. Some claim that it was possible to drive right across the country with a briefcase full of cash, provided taxes had been paid to Taylor. 2 banks opened in Bonga, Bong Bank and Grand Bank, both headed by a former governor of the National Bank of Liberia. Other business people may have found life less easy, especially later in the war, like the American gold and diamond buyer Robert Hoff, killed by an anti-NPFL group in Greater Liberia. After 1994 particularly, Taylor's territory was subject to widespread disturbances as NPFL troops in some areas took to wholesale looting of the towns they occupied. The extent of Greater Liberia in its heyday of 1990 to 1992, and Taylor's success in recruiting experienced managers and technocrats, including many who had previously worked for Doe, enabled him to appoint a full range of ministers and officials. Taylor established his executive mansion and government in Bonga, the capital of Bong County, strategically situated in the middle of Liberia. It is debatable how many of the ministers and director generals of Taylor's provisional government actually ran much in the way of real departments, other than those responsible for security and military matters, or those business managers who were answerable directly to Taylor himself. Taylor decreed a minimum wage for workers in the logging business of $2 a day, more than they had been getting before, although according to some sources, this was paid to Taylor's Forestry Development Authority rather than to the loggers themselves. The diamond and gold trade was the preserve of a handful of close aides, including his brother, Nelson Taylor. Taylor, more than most of his rival warlords, was also adept at mass political communication of a sort which reminded some observers of the old true Whig Party style. One Liberian who crossed over from Taylorland to Monrovia in 1991 said that NPFL fighters told the Crew fishermen on the coast, quote, that every fish in the ocean belonged to the CIC, the commander-in-chief, Taylor. Travelers to Taylor's capital at Bonga noticed growing signs of a personality cult. An American journalist visiting in 1992 saw hundreds of placards of Taylor displayed, the most recent ones showing just his face and the single word Ganke underneath. This was a Gola word meaning strong or stubborn, adopted by Taylor as a praise name designed to emphasize his indigenous roots. The man who in his youth had been proud to call himself Charles MacArthur Taylor began to claim that his mother was in fact a Gola woman, and he made efforts to learn an African language for the first time in his life, although by all accounts, he was never really successful. Many of Taylor's closest aides were foreigners, including the Gambian revolutionaries, or they were Americo-Liberians. Many of his bodyguards were Burkinabe. Beyond this commercial and military core, he distributed jobs in largesse to maintain an ethnic and regional balance of support and the usual fashion of West African politicians. The crucial Liberian-Ivorian border crossing was under the command of a Gambian, Mustafa Jallo, a fluent speaker of French and Spanish, the latter acquired during a stay in Cuba. Jallo, known in Liberia by the pseudonym General Cole, sometimes claimed that, as a revolutionary rather than a soldier, he was personally uncomfortable with the title of general. One of Taylor's main connections in Abidjan was a French businessman, Robert Sankoh, who had lived in Monrovia before the war and was friendly with leading Ivorian businessmen and politicians. Sankoh also enjoyed access to the French ambassador in Abidjan, Michel Dupuche, who visited both Bonga and Buchanan and developed close links to Taylor. Dupuche was later promoted to become the principal advisor on African affairs to the President of France, Jacques Chirac. The German ambassador to Sierra Leone and a South Korean ambassador also visited the capital of Taylorland at Bonga. The conquest of Greater Liberia, combined with his drive to dominate trade, soon brought Taylor into contact with social networks and informal trade routes which traversed Liberia's borders and brought opportunities for extending his influence on foreign territory. Taylor went on the offensive outside the country. He had long sought revenge against President Momo of Sierra Leone, who had slighted Taylor personally when he was seeking support for the launch of the war and had provided a base for the ECOMOG expeditionary force in 1990. Renewing his acquaintance with the Sierra Leonean rebels of the RUF, whom he had met in Libya and Burkina Faso, Taylor threatened Sierra Leoneans in a radio broadcast that they too would, quote, taste the bitterness of war. In March 1991, he sent some of the toughest units of his armed forces to accompany a group from the RUF over the border to Sierra Leone, where they attacked villages in the diamond-rich districts around Koindu, a major center of international trade, visited by trucks from as far afield as Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, and Senegal. The RUF was soon able to establish permanent headquarters inside Sierra Leone under the leadership of Foday Sankoh, the Sierra Leonean ex-army corporal whom Taylor had known for some years. This war was soon to develop a logic of its own, although it remained connected to the conflict in Liberia. Even though ECOMOG had prevented the NPFL from capturing Monrovia, Liberia's war had been exported to another West African country. The Nigerian government's great fear had now been realized. So now I'm going to jump ahead in The Mask of Anarchy, and I'm going to read what I consider to be an absolute banger of a chapter that has a ton of historical context and also some little tidbits about the personalities that were doing business in Greater Liberia during its early 90s heyday. This chapter is called Business and Diplomacy, and it starts off with some deep historical background about the long-existing shadow economies of West Africa and how they exerted a powerful influence on this conflict. So Ellis writes, among the new intake at a school in Calabar in Nigeria in 1920 was a 15-year-old boy with a bright future. He was astounded by his first conversation with one of his new classmates, a Liberian. I first heard of a country, the Nigerian recalled 50 years later, whose executive and administrative officials were black men. It was unbelievable. The young Nigerian was so impressed to learn of a country governed by black people that when he later went to America for higher study, he made a point of pursuing information about Liberia. In January 1931, he actually wrote to the Liberian government to seek employment as a Liberian diplomat, and 3 years later he published a book on Liberian foreign policy. The Calabar schoolboy, Nnamdi Azikiwe, was later to become a leading nationalist and eventually president of Nigeria. He was only one of many young intellectuals who considered Liberia a model of African self-rule at a time when almost the whole continent was under European colonial administration. Liberia's own elite in those days basked in the view that their country was a beacon for Africa and even a light to people of African descent in America. A visitor to Monrovia in the early 1940s noted how frequently church prayers and sermons made mention of Liberia's, quote, the great Negro democracy, the hope of the race, the land to which all blacks will someday return to live, like the Jews to Palestine. This view of Liberia is one of the mainstays of the rule of the true Whig Party, since it provided a grounding in religion and in reason for the descendants of American settlers to maintain their position of social and political superiority. Liberia's unique status disappeared with the gaining of independence by other West African countries, beginning with Ghana's proclamation as a sovereign state in 1957. At the time of West Africa's decolonization, perhaps the most important single question facing diplomats and politicians was whether the old colonial frontiers would remain intact, or whether the new states would split up to form new entities, or even combine in a United States of Africa, the Pan-Africanist dream. Since Liberia still enjoyed a residual prestige as the first African republic, the wily President Tubman became a founder of the Organization of African Unity and encouraged the organization to develop a policy to respect for existing borders, which would help safeguard his position against radical firebrands like Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah or his neighbor Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea. The first, and to date the most searching test of the durability of the new states of West Africa occurred in 1967, as a result of the attempt by one region to break away from the former British colony of Nigeria and to gain international recognition as the Republic of Biafra. If Biafra's attempt to leave Nigeria had succeeded, it would have broken up Nigeria, by far the largest and most powerful country in West Africa. There were some people outside Nigeria who favored the independence of Biafra less from any great sympathy with the rights of small nations than out of calculated self-interest. Prominent among such supporters of Biafra was France's leading regional ally, Félix Houphouet-Boigny, president of Côte d'Ivoire, who was instrumental in persuading France's president Charles de Gaulle to join him in helping Biafra. Both believed that Nigeria was a country too big and potentially powerful for their comfort, and that the interests of France and its West African partners were best served by keeping the Anglophone countries, particularly Nigeria, as weak as possible. Successive leaders of Nigeria have never forgotten this hostility and continue to regard Côte d'Ivoire, which still enjoys perhaps the closest relationship with Paris of all France's former West African colonies, as their most serious long-term rival in the area. Like most long-term diplomatic rivalries, it is largely economic in nature. The massive rise in world oil prices in 1973 and 74 turned Nigeria, the only major oil producer in West Africa, into a regional giant, flush with petrodollars. In 1975, the Nigerian government, hugely ambitious, was the prime mover in the establishment of a new economic community, ECOWAS, intended to develop into a regional common market with Nigeria at its center. Although this project failed to create an effective economic bloc, its continued existence is a reflection of the sheer weight of Nigeria's economy. While Nigeria was going richer on its oil revenues, other countries were facing an economic crisis as the prices of their staple export commodities fell in the late 70s. Côte d'Ivoire faced an alarming fall in the revenues from its main exports of cocoa and coffee. The Ivorian government, heavily indebted to international banks, was obliged to seek help from the lenders of last resort, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The bankers from Washington did not like what they found in Côte d'Ivoire, which was a government living beyond its means, over-reliant on a state-managed system of buying cocoa from individual farmers at fixed prices. As IMF and World Bank officials insisted on the liberalization of the Ivorian economy, and as the cocoa markets in London continued to offer only low prices for the country's leading crop, President Houphouet-Boigny, drawing to the end of a long and remarkable career, grew bitter. A former head of the French Secret Service recalls how the octogenarian president was convinced that the difficulties faced by his country were engineered in large part by what he called les Anglo-Saxons, by which he meant British and American commodity dealers and bankers working in collaboration with Nigeria. Houphouet-Boigny decided on a desperate gamble. He would withhold the entire Ivorian cocoa crop from the world market in the hope of forcing prices up and defeating the London commodity dealers. For 18 months, he was able to hold out, stockpiling hundreds of thousands of tons of cocoa and waiting for the market to buckle. But the old man had overplayed his hand. Overwhelmed by financial pressures, he was forced to admit failure and to recommence cocoa sales. In 1988, his friends in the French government helped him out by subsidizing a French commodity broker to buy the huge Ivorian cocoa stockpile, 400,000 tons, equivalent to a quarter of the world's annual production, at a price above that of the current world market value, thanks to a subsidy from the French taxpayer arranged by Jean-Christophe Mitterrand, son of the President of France and principal advisor on African affairs at the Élysée Palace. Now remember, H. Boima Fahnbulleh named Papa Madi Jean-Christophe Mitterrand, who had a great relationship with the Americans, according to Chet Crocker, as a supporter and business partner of Charles Taylor. We'll get to that shortly. Going on, while Côte d'Ivoire had flourished since independence on its close relationship with France, its economy became dangerously uncompetitive once a general fall in commodity prices had exposed its position. Like every other French-speaking state in the region, with the exception of Guinea and briefly Mali, Côte d'Ivoire had remained a member of the Communauté Financière Africaine, the CFA, a monetary union in which member states used the CFA franc, which was pegged until 1994 at 50 CFA to 1 French franc. This made the CFA in effect a hard currency, since it had the strength of the French franc behind it. The English-speaking countries of the region, on the other hand, on becoming independent in the 50s and 60s, had all created their own national currencies, whose international value soon declined. Potentially the strongest of these was the Nigerian naira, in view of Nigeria's oil wealth, but the nature of the Nigerian government and its record of economic and financial mismanagement did not inspire business confidence. The one haven of monetary stability in English-speaking West Africa, at least until the 1980s, was Liberia, whose official currency was the mighty US dollar. Even when Samuel Doe began minting his own coins with U.S. acquiescence, the U.S. dollar continued to be legal tender in Liberia, making it a useful location for traders wanting to switch from weak local currencies to internationally negotiable ones, or for businessmen and women who, for one reason or another, wanted to, quote, park dollars earned in other markets. As far back as the 1940s, Liberia had established itself as an offshore business center where foreign businessmen could register companies which they could use for transactions in a dollar zone. Côte d'Ivoire was not the only African country to encounter serious financial problems as profound changes in world commodity markets reduced their income and made them vulnerable to competition from new producers in Asia and Latin America. One African government after another sought help from the IMF and the World Bank. The international financial institutions insisted on similar reforms from all of their clients: budget cutting, currency devaluation, and market liberalization. Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone were all obliged to devalue their national currencies by huge amounts and saw their market value depreciate. The French-speaking countries, confident of the firmness of their CFA franc and supported by a French government at first skeptical of the World Bank's and IMF's zeal for free trade, were able to resist these pressures longer than their Anglophone neighbors. To avoid holding nairas which were not negotiable internationally, Nigerian business people operating in international markets increasingly sought to change their depreciating nairas into hard CFA francs, if necessary, illegally. Major Nigerian or Nigerian-based entrepreneurs in the import-export business often deposited their CFA francs in bank accounts in London or Switzerland, where they could eventually be converted to other hard currencies such as sterling or dollars. The depreciation of the naira hit Nigerian consumers badly, but it did have the positive effect of reducing the price of Nigerian exports and giving Nigerian manufacturers a price advantage over their French-speaking competitors. Markets throughout West Africa became flooded with goods made in Nigeria, often locally made copies of international brand car parts, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, alcohol, and other consumer goods, or re-exports of electrical goods from Taiwan and the Far East. The tendency of Nigerian traders to convert their profits into CFA francs and to bank these in Europe where they could be exchanged for French francs meant that the French treasury found itself having to pay increasingly large sums of money to buy the CFA francs being offered to it. By a circuitous route, the French taxpayer, as well as subsidizing Ivorian cocoa, was also paying incentives to the Nigerian businessmen who were taking over traditionally French markets in Côte d'Ivoire and throughout West Africa. Many of the low-priced Nigerian exports or re-exports which flooded West African markets were smuggled rather than going through formal trade channels. Particularly lucrative was the smuggling of petrol. The Nigerian government subsidized the sale of petroleum products on the grounds that this would allow ordinary Nigerian citizens to benefit from their country's oil reserves. However, what the subsidy also did was to enable people with the necessary connections to export petroleum products subsidized by the Nigerian government for sale at a higher price in neighboring countries. Although this was illegal, it took place on a huge scale, and Nigeria itself sometimes suffered from periodic petrol shortages as a result. Some of the cross-border smuggling which developed so rapidly in the 1980s was no more than the continuation of age-old trade routes, such as between northern Nigeria and Niger, but rather more of it was a direct response to artificial price differentials and currency movements. While smugglers could avoid paying official taxes and dues, they generally had to pay other charges, bribes, in order to carry out their transactions. Over time, the growth of smuggling and informal trade throughout West Africa has created a system where traders manipulate both formal and informal markets, and where officials connive at practices which they are officially supposed to prevent, creating webs of vested interests which liberalization and privatization have served only to make still more complex. These developments have also enabled controllers of local smuggling networks to make inroads into world markets. Since the early 1980s, Nigeria has become a major importer and re-exporter of narcotics, particularly heroin from Southeast Asia, a trade which involves Nigerian criminal syndicates making use of facilities in neighboring countries for the physical transport of contraband goods, as well as using hard currency zones for money laundering.
Your state house no day.
Now, this next section is where it gets particularly interesting, so strap yourself in. Ellis goes on, rapid shifts in trade practices and the boom in the international narcotics trade brought Liberia to the attention of Nigerian traders especially. Liberia had an established reputation as a location for depositing and laundering funds of dubious origin, thanks to the fact that the US dollar was its official currency from 1944. As early as the 1950s, at least one major international operator, a banker to the Israeli Secret Services and to the U.S. underworld boss Meyer Lansky, the pioneer of modern money laundering, was using Liberia as one of his centers of operation. And Ellis doesn't name that banker, but I'm pretty sure it is Tibor Rosenbaum. There is some evidence that President Tolbert was acquainted with international drug traffickers. Samuel Doe continued the practice of using the facilities of a sovereign state to conduct personal deals of dubious legality with major international criminals. He cultivated a brief relationship with the notorious Italian fraudster Giancarlo Peretti, whom he made an ambassador at large to the Liberian government. Peretti negotiated to buy a 49% share of Air Liberia and was also interested in the privatization of Liberia's oil operations. Doe and Peretti are said to have used the oil business as a source of revenue to buy companies abroad, and Peretti was later to use similar techniques in other parts of Africa. The more the U.S. government tried to persuade Doe to reform by putting him under financial pressure, the more he resorted to dealing informally with sleazy international businessmen, bartering timber for guns, and encouraging all manner of money laundering and quick-fix financial operations. In addition to a host of other dubious ventures, Doe's Minister of Finance, Emmanuel Shaw, established relationships with an array of colorful characters trading in Nigerian oil via the Liberian National Petroleum Corporation, including with South Africa. Now, remember that name, Giancarlo Peretti, because he represents a major rabbit hole in all of this. But going on. While a few foreigners and rather fewer Liberians grew rich on rackets of this sort, the 1980s were in general an economic catastrophe for Liberia. The country's economy actually shrank during the decade when Doe was in power. Foreigners pulled their money out, creating a currency shortage, which was rectified with the introduction of Liberian-issued Doe dollars, giving the country a two-tier currency system. Liberia's main hard currency earner was iron ore, developed in the 1950s and 60s, which contributed some 40% of the country's GDP in 1975. This sector too suffered in the 80s, falling to just 15% of GDP between 1981 and 85. This decline was not entirely the result of mismanagement by the Liberian government, but was also because the country's biggest iron ore mine at Yakepa in Nimba County was coming close to depletion. The Yakepa mine was situated right next to Liberia's border with Guinea, and on the other side of the border there were vast reserves of ore, which could be worked only with the agreement of the Guinean government. As Liberia's own iron ore reserves were depleted, international mining companies began to search for ways of developing mines on the Guinean side of the border, using Liberia's infrastructure to export the ore. Just as the sharp movements in commodity prices in the 1980s had produced major shifts in the cocoa and oil markets, so too were there worldwide changes in patterns of iron ore production. Large new iron ore mines were opened in Brazil. Together with other producers in Canada and Australia, the Brazilians used their market strength to push up the international price of iron ore by about 40% between 1988 and 1990. Precisely as the Ivorian government had failed to achieve with cocoa. The European and Asian steel industries in particular, squeezed by the producers, were anxious to find a reliable new source of iron ore, and they thought they had located it on the northern side of the Nimba mountain range, which straddles the border between Liberia and Guinea. Mount Nimba contains some of the world's highest quality iron ore. From 1961, the deposit on the Liberian side, the most important source of Liberia's iron ore exports, was worked intensively by a Liberian-American-Swedish conglomerate known as LAMCO, then the leading payer of tax to the Liberian government, while the reserves on the Guinean side, some 3/5 of the total, remained untouched for as long as the capitalist-unfriendly President Sékou Touré remained in power. After Sékou Touré's death in 1984, potential investors discussed with the new Guinean government the possibility of a consortium, mefergi, exploiting the ore on the Guinean side of the border. There was opposition from Western environmentalists concerned by the threat to the tropical rainforest and its flora and fauna, but a greater problem was the lack of a rail link to evacuate the iron ore from the Guinean part of the Nimba mountain range to Guinea's main port at Conakry, 640 miles away. Investors proposed bringing the Liberian government into the equation so that the existing infrastructure in Liberia could be used to export the Guinean ore via the 187-mile railway line, which already ran from Yakepa, the site of the Lamco mine close to the Guinean border, to the Liberian port of Buchanan. If this succeeded, it would be one of the biggest mining projects ever undertaken in Africa. Experts estimated that, if the Guinean side of Mount Nimba were mined, the project could export 12 million tons of ore per year for up to 50 years before depletion. In 1989, a deal was agreed between the investors and the Liberian and Guinean governments. Everything was set for work to begin on the Guinean side of Mount Nimba when the NPFL's Christmas Eve 1989 offensive in Nimba County threw the scheme into doubt. And I'm going to keep reading from the next section called The Game of Nations. Although European investors had developed substantial interests in Liberian iron ore mines since the 1950s, there had never been any doubt that the country's special relationship was less with Europe than with the U.S. Liberia had been the leading U.S. ally in West Africa since the 19th century and a source of U.S. raw materials since the Firestone Agreement of 1926. President Franklin Roosevelt visited Liberia in 1943, when all the other countries in the region were still under colonial rule, to negotiate rights to harbor and airfield facilities, which made the country also a strategic asset. By the 1980s, Liberia was home to a major CIA station, a satellite tracking station, and a Voice of America transmitter, apart from the U.S. economic interests represented by Firestone and other investors. It was the American government's concern to preserve these assets which caused Washington to withdraw its support from, or I would say assassinate, President Tolbert in 1980 after he had refused to allow Roberts International Airport to be used as a staging post for a U.S. rapid deployment force en route to the Middle East. Perhaps the most remarkable skill developed by Samuel Doe after he succeeded Tolbert as head of state in 1980 was his ability to play on American fears of destabilization. As head of state, he consistently supported the U.S. in international fora, even reopening diplomatic relations with Israel at American behest. This he traded for U.S. financial and diplomatic support for his government. Doe's diplomatic strategy was particularly effective in the 80s because of President Ronald Reagan's personal antipathy to the Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi, whose brand of theatrical posturing seemed especially to irritate the American president. Libya bought an estimated $1 billion worth of arms every year from the Soviet Union, providing an important source of hard currency for the Soviet economy. Doe used his membership of the Organization of African Unity and various other Third World organizations to launch a series of outspoken attacks on Gaddafi, which were greatly appreciated in Washington. As we have seen, in 1987, the Libyan government began hosting an army of Liberian exiles, with a view of driving the U.S. out of its main West African base. It was through their shared antipathy to Samuel Doe that the ferociously anti-American Colonel Gaddafi found himself sharing the same set of allies as the Ivorian patriarch, the doyen of Francophone Africa, Félix Houphouet-Boigny. The radical young officers who ruled Burkina Faso after 1983, revolutionary in their rhetoric and pro-Libyan in their foreign policy, caused serious concern to Houphouet-Boigny. The Burkinabe president, Thomas Sankara, dashing, articulate, and handsome, was a hero to youth all over West Africa, where the economic crisis of the 80s had alienated a generation of young people born after independence who had grown up expecting their governments to provide them with jobs and education. All over West Africa, there were radical students and would-be revolutionaries seeking inspiration, some seeing it in the Libyan system of revolutionary committees, others in the North Korean ideology of Juche or other alternatives. It was largely disaffected youths of this ilk who found their way to the training camps run by Colonel Gaddafi's World Revolutionary Headquarters in Libya. Like other West African heads of state, Houphouet-Boigny regarded his diplomatic friendships, business partnerships, and marriage alliances as both the sinews of political relationships and a reflection of national aspirations, like the royal marriages and dynastic alliances of the old Europe. When Captain Karpeh married one of Houphouet-Boigny's numerous young female protégées, Daisy Delafosse Tolbert, overthrew Sankara in 1987, the Ivorian president could feel confident that the government in Burkina Faso offered no further threat. When another ambitious young man, Charles Taylor, in turn became friendly with President Karpeh of Burkina Faso, and when in 1989 these two used Côte d'Ivoire for an attack on Liberia, Houphouet-Boigny did not even take the trouble to meet Taylor. It was only later, during the numerous peace conferences which the Liberian War inspired, that he met him for the first time. Where a rapprochement between the Libyan government and the leading Francophone government in West Africa might just a few years earlier have caused serious concern in Washington, the real threat which Libyan adventures in West Africa could pose to the U.S. government was rapidly diminishing in the late 80s as the Cold War drew to a close and as Ronald Reagan left the world stage. For the same reason, the U.S. was able to distance itself from Samuel Doe, its expensive and embarrassing ally in Monrovia. Doe drew closer to another mentor, the Nigerian president, Ibrahim Babangida. Like Doe, Babangida was a military man who had come to power via military coup. He took a somewhat paternal interest in Doe and became a personal friend. The two presidents became business partners by taking joint control of the Liberian National Petroleum Company, the LNPC, which acquired a monopoly for importing Nigerian oil, which it sold to the state-owned Liberian Petroleum Refinery. The LNPC also exported petroleum products to Sierra Leone, Gambia, Senegal, Togo, and even Nigeria itself, competing with the refinery in Côte d'Ivoire. Liberia became a main supplier of iron ore for the Nigerian steel industry. President Babangida on one occasion paid Liberian government debt with Nigerian public funds, claiming this to be a gesture of Pan-African solidarity. The money may possibly have been deposited in Eurobank, an establishment in Monrovia in which Doe and Babangida are said to have had an interest. Liberia became President Babangida's offshore banking and business center. The Nigerian president paid for the establishment at the University of Liberia of the Babangida School of International Diplomacy, whose staff, including at least 8 Nigerian expatriates, were paid by the Nigerian government in foreign exchange. A new road linking Liberia and Sierra Leone was officially named the IBB International Highway in Babangida's honor. According to Charles Taylor, Doe was also in business with Sir Dawda Jawara, president of Gambia. Thus, by the late 1980s, a new regional division of forces was emerging around Liberia as the old Cold War power blocks unfroze. Nigeria, the aspiring hegemon of West Africa, became the Liberian government's main ally. The leader of Francophone West Africa, Côte d'Ivoire, was firmly in the anti-Doe camp. So too, after the accession to power of Blaise Compaoré in October 1987, was Burkina Faso, allied with both Côte d'Ivoire and Libya. Charles Taylor and other leaders of the NPFL received a consignment of weapons from Libya and, according to Prince Johnson, millions of dollars in cash to finance a campaign. Taylor was shuttling between Libya, Burkina Faso, where most of the NPFL fighters completed their training, and Côte d'Ivoire, from which the attack was to be launched. American, French, British, and Japanese businessmen and bankers were focused on the Mount Nimba iron ore project, straddling the border of Guinea and Nimba County. During the first few years of the Liberian War, much of the international interest in who controlled the country was dictated by the desire of international investors to put the iron ore scheme into full operation. When it became clear that Côte d'Ivoire was backing the NPFL, Taylor could count on a fair degree of sympathy from the French-speaking countries of the region, and he was soon to acquire significant support in France itself. The launching of the NPFL invasion on Christmas 1989 was of particular concern to the English-speaking governments of West Africa, unnerved by the presence of exiled revolutionaries from their own countries alongside Taylor. The Nigerian government was afraid that an NPFL victory would take Liberia into the French-speaking camp, and that Taylor, if he became president, would use Liberia as a base to destabilize Nigeria itself by providing arms and training to exiled opponents. The Ghanaian government was similarly disturbed by the specter of a civilian-led uprising and by the knowledge that there were Ghanaian dissidents fighting for the NPFL. According to a Ghanaian intelligence officer, quote, President Rawlings was worried that if Taylor triumphed, Liberia would be used to launch armed attacks on Ghana. The executive secretary of ECOWAS later recalled, I think if there was one principle that united the entire West African leadership, it was the one that said that West Africa, as a region, should not accept anyone who sought to shoot his way to power, especially if that person is actively aided and abetted by outside forces. In view of the number of West African heads of state who had already shot their way to power, the fact that Taylor was a civilian rather than a soldier, and that he was aided by an outside power bent on destabilization, was presumably the most telling consideration. By June 1990, with the Liberian insurrection 6 months old, thousands dead, and the international media taking a serious interest for the first time, it had become clear that this was Africa's first major crisis since the end of the Cold War, if the latter is measured by the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. All the diplomatic players were exploring unknown territory since the unwritten conventions governing international relations were so clearly in flux. During the Cold War, there would have been no question of Washington allowing a protracted war in Liberia, its main West African ally. When a U.S. fleet with 2,000 Marines on board headed for Monrovia in June 1990, Liberians hoped the U.S. would intervene to restore order, but U.S. diplomats procrastinated. No vital American interest was involved in Liberia, and the U.S. government, reluctant to become the world's policeman, was urging the need for regional solutions to regional problems. The Nigerian government, on the other hand, took the situation in Liberia very seriously. It raised the matter at an ECOWAS summit meeting in May, when Nigeria was also reported to be supplying the embattled dough with weapons. Washington's encouragement of Nigeria to adopt a regional peacemaking role further disgusted Houphouet-Boigny, who, France's intelligence chief noted, complained that the Americans, quote, have pushed Nigeria to play the role of the gendarme of the region, which is not acceptable either in principle or in this specific case. Nigeria hastily secured the backing of ECOWAS, in spite of Ivorian and Burkinabe objections, for the formation of ECOMOG. The Ivorian and Burkinabe response to Nigeria's initiative was to increase their support for the NPFL. The French National Press Agency reported in September 1990 that 100 Burkinabe troops from the elite garrison at Po, as well as Ivorian nationals, were fighting with the NPFL. In September 1990, the correspondent for Le Monde and Radio France Internationale was expelled from Côte d'Ivoire after he reported that the Ivorian government was supporting the NPFL. Perhaps his real fault was to have reported a Libyan plane landing at Roberts International Airport in Liberia, now under NPFL control, to deliver French-made weapons. One of Charles Taylor's brothers, Bardas, was living at Dinan in the north of Côte d'Ivoire and was in effect acting as Taylor's consul there. Burkina Faso was to support Taylor consistently throughout the war, and President Compaoré later publicly admitted having sent 700 troops to Liberia, while Charles Taylor enjoyed the use of a Fokker F-28 of Air Burkina. He lived in Ouagadougou for much of the early part of the war and was able to train his forces at a Burkinabe military base in Po. In this way, by late August 1990, when the U.S. had definitely opted for non-intervention, each of the two major armed forces then deployed in Liberia, the Nigerian-dominated ECOMOG and the Ivorian-backed NPFL, was working closely with one or more regional allies whose interests were partly political and partly economic. Behind these regional powers were external backers, with France supporting Côte d'Ivoire and the NPFL, while the United States, having initially encouraged the Nigerian intervention, lurched from one position to another as its diplomats railed at Nigerian corruption and blew hot and cold in their opposition to Taylor. Herman Cohen, the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, when asked at the end of his term of office what was his greatest failure, said it was, quote, my inability to negotiate a peaceful settlement of the Liberian crisis at the beginning of the 1990s. As the war settled into a pattern, with ECOMOG controlling Monrovia and Taylor ruling the rest of the country, The Nigerian contingent in ECOMOG formed alliances with various local warlords who emerged after 1990, especially Roosevelt Johnson of ULIMO-J, George Boley of the LPC, and the collective leadership of the AFL, while Guinea's interests were articulated through ULIMO-K. Liberia became a prime example of how an imploding state may lose political autonomy but extend its sphere of economic influence as an unregulated economy of plunder comes to dominate. And now, the final section here I'm going to read, which is titled Markets and Rackets. The Liberian factions which emerged during the Civil War came, then, to represent the cutting edge of international business and political syndicates whose principles were in Conakry, Abidjan, Lagos, and Abuja in West Africa, with associates in Paris, Washington, and other centers further afield. At the outset of the war, the greatest single economic prize was the Nimba iron ore project, promising hundreds of millions of tons of high-grade iron ore for the steel mills of the world's industrial nations. The most active component of the investors' consortium was the French company Bureau de Recherche Géologique et Minière, BRGM, which had secured funds from Japan's Sumitomo Corporation and a promise of major investment from the London-based African Mining Consortium Limited, which grouped various British, Japanese, and American investors, including some U.S.-based Liberian exiles. When Charles Taylor, a shrewd businessman and a tough negotiator, found that he had overrun most of Liberia without yet becoming president, he immediately approached various business people, sometimes using his U.S. lawyer, Ramsey Clark. How about that? This is right around the time, by the way, that Ramsey Clark, I think, was reassuring his other client, Saddam Hussein, that he should go ahead and invade Kuwait because the massive anti-war movement that Ramsey was about to lead in the United States would surely prevent U.S. intervention. I think this is also during the time that Ramsey rather abruptly began his affiliation with the Trotskyist Workers' World Party. So very epic and socialist of him to help Charles Taylor make business contacts in the United States, right? Anyways, going on. In June 1990, Taylor contacted the African Mining Consortium with a proposal to restart iron ore exports from Buchanan and to press ahead with the Nimba scheme, since he had the port and the railway to Mount Nimba under his control. The investors agreed to continue operating the Liberian iron ore mines, while major investment on the Guinean side, the real plum, would wait until the end of the war. Limited working of the Nimba mines began in 1991 with Taylor's accord. 70,000 tons of ore per month were exported via Buchanan, most of it shipped to the French port of Dunkirk, for which the operators paid Taylor a royalty of $80,000 per month. The director of the French company BRGM, Francis Labro, maintained regular contacts both with the French Foreign Ministry and with the Élysée Palace, where Jean-Christophe Mitterrand handled African affairs until 1990, while the French ambassador in Abidjan, Michel Dupouche, later to become principal advisor on African affairs to President Jacques Chirac, also took a close interest. Iron ore continued to be exported from the mine on the Liberian side of the border until 1993, when ECOMOG took the port of Buchanan, the export outlet. This cut off one of Taylor's main sources of revenue, and the Nigerian contingent looted the town so comprehensively, exporting shiploads of industrial equipment, that the iron ore processing plant at Buchanan would require millions of dollars of new investment to become workable again. Franco-Ivorian interests benefited from other possibilities opened up by Taylor's control of Greater Liberia. Ivorian-based logging companies, having exhausted most of Côte d'Ivoire's finest hardwood, gained access to the primary forests of Nimba in the Liberian southeast. Ivorian, French, Italian, Israeli, Dutch, Thai, and other logging companies all established themselves in Greater Liberia. Among the Ivorians doing business with Taylor, according to Liberian government ministers, were members of the family of President Houphouet-Boigny's political chief of staff, or chef de cabinet. The Ivorian port of San Pedro boomed on exports from eastern Liberia, and its main hotel became the base for Liberian exiles, including 2 ex-ministers who managed their interests in the wood and rubber businesses from this Ivorian base. In 1991 and 92, Taylor's Greater Liberia is estimated to have produced 343,000 cubic meters of timber, which it exported to France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Greece, Portugal, and Turkey. Liberia became France's third biggest supplier of wood. Quote, "The French have for centuries been great lovers of fine hardwood furniture, so they look to the African countries, and where better than in the land of those fools in Liberia who don't have enough sense to put their act together." And this is really something. Among the logging businesses operating in Liberia was a front company which, it is alleged, had close links to the Unification Church, the Moonies. Details of hardwood cargoes carried by just 2 ships used in the hardwood trade reveal 8 shipments of logs exported from Sino in southeastern Liberia between December 94 and March 95 alone, of which 4 were to Bordeaux and 1 to Nantes in France and 3 to Les Jeux, Portugal. So the Moonies got into this business, always on the lookout for a new business opportunity, right? Interesting. Now, skipping ahead just a little bit, Charles Taylor, who had become a multi-millionaire within months of the war starting, dealt mostly with banks in Abidjan, particularly EcoBank and the Société Générale, SGBCI, and in Ouagadougou. He also controlled an account at Abidjan Citibank. He is reported to have engaged the services of a well-known public relations firm in the U.S., Swindler in Berlin. The RUF-NPFL invasion of Sierra Leone in March 1991 opened up a new field of business. NPFL soldiers openly boasted that they were in Sierra Leone to, quote, retrieve properties, loot that they had sold across the border. However, by 1992, the counteroffensive by a rival faction, ULIMO, had gained control of diamond-rich areas in both Sierra Leone and Liberia, enabling ULIMO leaders and their allies in Freetown and Conakry to acquire diamonds which they sold in Antwerp, the world's major free market for diamonds. According to official diamond industry statistics, Liberia had become the 3rd biggest supplier of diamonds to Antwerp by 1994, and in 1995 its supplies increased by 227% measured by carats and 91% by value. Liberian diamonds were being exported through Conakry, while Guinean and Sierra Leonean diamonds could also be exported to Antwerp and represented as being from Liberia. Even Angolan diamonds may have been traded under the cover of being Liberian goods, since the Angolan opposition movement UNITA had its main business center in Abidjan. Interesting. The CIA-backed UNITA was laundering diamonds through Liberia, perhaps. According to the president of Gambia, both diamonds and marijuana from Liberia were transiting overland through the long-distance trade networks dominated by Malinke businessmen as far as Senegal and Gambia, linking the business of the Liberian War with the marketing of war goods from the low-level conflict in Casamance in Senegal. Gambia became a leading diamond exporter, although it has no naturally occurring diamonds. As the war settled into a stalemate after Doe's death in September 1990, every Liberian faction and its external backers developed an interest in the burgeoning war economy. Diamonds, gold, drugs, rubber, wood, looted goods, scrap metal, palm oil, coffee, cocoa, and of course, weapons were all traded. The NPFL appears to have developed connections with the Casamance separatist movement via the sale of weapons in return for payment in marijuana grown in southern Senegal. Even more than the diamond trade, the extent of the marijuana trade was difficult to measure. Charles Taylor could have become acquainted with drug traders during his sojourn in a Massachusetts jail in 1983 to 1985. In 1986, he was reported to have held the opinion that African governments should earn hard currency by exporting drugs. Quote, he further stressed that we should think of cultivating coca and marijuana. This is a very interesting quote, if it's true. Taylor's cellmate says, he was particularly peeved about the fact that African governments complain of lack of capital when they have the easy option of granting banking facilities to drug barons who have billions of dollars for laundering. During the war, marijuana is reported to have been exported from NPFL-held territory via San Pedro in Côte d'Ivoire, where well-organized Ivorian, French, Lebanese, and other crime syndicates operated, including one especially prominent Corsican ring. The Corsican mafia in Abidjan had traditionally specialized in logging, cigarette smuggling, and local prostitution, but by the 1990s was increasingly involved in sending African women to work as sex slaves in brothels in Europe, often also acting as couriers carrying heroin or cocaine. By the mid-90s, underground crack cocaine factories were operating in Abidjan, but Ivorian racketeers were facing stiff competition from an influx of Nigerian drug networks, many of them operating out of Benin. These exported poor-quality Nigerian-made amphetamines and heroin from Southeast Asia, the latter often transported via Ethiopia and Nigeria itself. Before 1984, the main source of amphetamines had been Guinea. Streetwise Ivorians called the Guinean-made drug Sekou Touré in honor of the Guinean president of the time, since consumption caused people to talk fast and at interminable length. In the face of fierce competition from Nigeria, NPFL warlords were successful in pioneering their own drug routes. In 1997, Dutch police revealed the existence of a large-scale racket said to be operating under the protection of the NPFL. One of several people arrested by the Dutch police on suspicion of importing thousands of kilograms of hashish was the honorary consul of a West African country in Rotterdam. Also reported as wanted for questioning was one of Taylor's closest associates, a Dutchman, with interests in gambling, prostitution, hardwood, and weapons smuggling. This man had developed a business relationship with Samuel Doe in the 1980s before switching to Charles Taylor during the war. An investigation by the Dutch police is reported to have revealed that Liberia was being used as a transit point for Pakistani hashish to be transferred to smaller boats for re-export to Rotterdam, while the distributors in the Netherlands were said to be working with Polish crime syndicates. And Ellis does not mention the name of that mysterious Dutch businessman, but I'm pretty sure he is referring to Gus Kuenhoven, who Emmanuel Bowier mentioned ran one of the airlines in Liberia at the dawn of 1990 and did not own but operated the Hotel Africa. Gus Kuenhoven is going to pop up many, many times later down the road in this. But we're going to pause right there for now and take stock of all the information that I just laid out. So by 1991, various economic interests from all over the world start descending upon Liberia, interested in everything from the Nimba County iron ore project, to gold, to diamonds, to rubber, to marijuana, palm oil, and everything in between. And that essentially is going to become the chief defining characteristic of the Liberian Civil War. And I've been thinking about exactly what to call it because we've invoked Kwame Nkrumah's term neocolonialism a lot so far in this series. But what happens in Liberia, while it bears very strong similarities to the phenomenon of neocolonialism, it's a little bit different. Because neocolonialism, as Nkrumah defined it, is basically a continuation of colonial domination through the more veiled mediation of a quote-unquote democratic or at least native government. So instead of traditional colonialism, where you would have, say, French people as the government administrators directly in a place like Côte d'Ivoire, neocolonialism, you have somebody like Félix Houphouet-Boigny, who is a native Ivorian, but at the same time maintains many of the political and economic relationships with France. And then this new era starts, and the one difference between 1990s Liberia and these other neo-colonial governments during the Cold War is that there isn't even a stable central government to be co-opted. So a term popped into my head that might describe this a little better. I would call this anarcho-colonialism, or maybe anarcho-imperialism, because the chief characteristic is outside forces introducing anarchy and civil breakdown and war into a society, essentially abolishing any kind of stable government and then allowing these clandestine economic actors to go in there and extract resources in the most direct way possible by going to the people who have the guns that control the territory where the resources are. And you heard Ellis say there how many of the businessmen that were doing business in Taylorland during its heyday between 1990 and 92 almost talked about it nostalgically as this paradise, this transactional paradise where you could just go to the local NPFL commander, pay your bribe or your tax, and get what you wanted. And when you come to think of it, it is quite appropriate that the quote-unquote warlord that would kick off this state of affairs and set up this very brutal free trade zone in the territory of Greater Liberia, it's very fitting that Charles Taylor is, like he said, an American-trained economist, because that's very much how he approaches this conflict, it seems, in business terms, because war, after all, is a celebration of markets, right? But it is still a war, and there's one crucial component that you need if you want to fight a war, and that's weapons. We haven't talked too much yet, only a little bit, about where Charles Taylor was getting arms from, but that is one of the most crucial and incredible aspects of this whole story. In part 2 and part 3, and probably part 4, we are going to focus on the very consequential question of where was Charles Taylor getting his weapons from? Now, given everything I've read so far, you might think, oh, well, he was getting them from La Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso and from Libya. That's all true, but they didn't provide him with the bulk of his guns for the entire duration of the conflict. Charles Taylor, ever the entrepreneur, had to look elsewhere. And I'm not even talking about the French, nor am I necessarily talking about those advanced weapons from Spain that David Charles Miller says he got. I'm talking about the weapons from the newly decommunized and disintegrating Warsaw Pact countries. So when we come back, we're going to answer the question once and for all of who were Charles Taylor's arms dealers. Because when we answer that question, we might just find a skeleton key that will unlock the mystery of why the US government allowed this disastrous war, this genocidal nightmare, to occur. So much so that they were willing to sacrifice their own strategically critical military and intelligence stations there. The Cold War was ending doesn't quite cover it for me as a viable excuse. Who was gaining something from this? What were they after? And what role did all of this carnage play in the establishment of the New World Order of George Herbert Walker Bush?
I will go a step further and say, I don't have to be a member of a particular church or marry into a particular family to be somebody. This is my country. And people must be promoted on the basis of merits. There's nobody's farm. It's not your farm. It's your country. It's my country. And the same way you are passionate about the country, I too am passionate about my country. And if you institute tyranny, as the nationalist and patriot, it's my duty to oppose. And that we will do. Some people in the attempt at demonization refer to us as recircle politicians. I said in a speech, insofar as injustice is recircled, we'll be around, we'll be recircled. Insofar there is injustice and poverty, we'll be around, we'll be recircled. Because we have to fight against this. If we must build a society of cohesion, a society of unity, we must begin to respect every man and woman, irrespective of where they come from. No matter who they are. You cannot claim any special right to the the sword because your father was from Morocco, grew up. Your symbols, a young brother said to you, look at your symbols. Look at your symbol. We've been saying it for years. Years. You don't want to meet in a national sovereign conference and deal with this question of your symbol. They're symbols of domination. The symbols of domination. And so your falsified history must be rectified. And people say, but the history has not been written. It is not that it has been written, it's that you have not read the history. That is the problem. You've read the history that you want to read, that they want you to read. There's a lot of history out there. We deal with Liberia and the crisis in Liberia. The problem of identification. Who are we? And let me say something. It's just a joke. I was saying to a brother in Nigeria, I said, the war is terrible. It's terrible. But there's something positive. Many of our people, especially from our so-called upper class, they have come to Ghana, Nigeria, and they've gone to Sierra Leone, Guinea. I said they now realize that so-called civilized, educated women from the upper class wear African costume. They feel proud. I said, in my country, they thought the market women wore these things. Before they stopped, they went to the national functions, burning heat, gloves, bowler hat, coat. These people, I said to him, these people never thought they were African people. They never thought they were African people. That is your history. So examine your history. See the crisis that you developed. And your tragedy is that your fathers and forefathers, most of them were not courageous enough to confront the problems. So they threw the problems on the lap of their children. And their children inherited the problems, like Tolbert and others, who inherited the problem. But whether I can tell you something, do or no do, moja or no moja, pal or no pal, PPP, the way this society is organized or was organized, it was just a matter of time. Just a matter of time. That's when we came in.
See some very good action. Did you manage to get a shot of one of the pieces of equipment that we captured, the Stalin missile? Why don't we walk down? We have a guest that we'll yeah, why don't we come down and get a shot? Where's the producer? Say I look pretty well, huh? Yes, sir. It's a tiring process, I tell you. Having to plan this whole thing and see it happen has been a real serious battle. I guess maybe my skills in economic and management helped me some.
I don't have regrets that you started it, do you?
In terms of military and political regrets, no. About the social part, there have been serious loss of life. By the enemy came in, and you're going to see some of the towns. You're going down here to watch it. And just shot up towns and villages. And so they are babies and old people that got killed. So the social part, we didn't think that the enemy would resort to such irresponsible behavior by killing civilians. We thought that they would take this as a military conflict, but they didn't see it that way. So on that side, yes, we have some serious regrets that so many young people and old people, pregnant women and different things got killed. We have a crown soldier here from those tribe that committed some of the worst atrocities that you can find. We have him in prison here. We didn't kill him. He opened pregnant women. He's here. He will get a chance to take them. Cut hands off, cut throats, and dismembered people. He was so terrible that they call him the 1-foot devil. So he's here. We have him as a building unit. We've tried our best with very, very tight constraints to try to accept some of the treaties covering from the Geneva Convention covering conflicts as such. And so we've really dealt with the expatriate population in a very humane way and tried to rescue them and get them out. So besides the Jacksons that had a misfortune here, we haven't had any loss of expatriate life. And I think our record is very, very good. We're going to show you some equipment here that we captured from them. That's why I brought you down here. This, you help me with that. Yeah. This is the 105 house that we just captured from Rock Island, in the United States. But this is not new because there's no problem with that because the United States has historically supplied Liberians with artillery pieces. So this is from Rock Island, but there's nothing wrong with that because it was not given to those fighters. I don't want that in. But this is a 40-barrel Stallion missile that we recently captured that had been fired at towns and villages throughout this county. There are three pieces of this. It's a 40-barrel, I think 140 millimeter guns. And he fired several hundreds at the towns and villages throughout this place. Now this is a Romanian-made piece of equipment. Now there's one at the exact dimension and one in 2-zone. The one in 2-zone cannot be used against the several other artillery pieces that he's mounted around Monrovia, including mines and explosives that our people are trained and they'll be able to avoid, but he hasn't been able to kill us with these yet. But if things like these are unleashed on a capital, there will be no Monrovia. And these are some of the considerations, not the equipment, but the people. If we had a means of evacuating Monrovia, our dog would wait for me. He'll see me personally. But this is a recent piece. And this was bought with money from the United States that he misused. Senator Kennedy's commission that did a report with the GAO monies that were given for development. He bought this piece of equipment to use against our people. Imagine an internal conflict where these 140 millimeter guns are used. Several hundred rounds were fired. And towns are burned. As you drive, you see them. Old towns burned. So these are some of the considerations that we have to talk about. Liberia. He probably got some notes from a library deep in Harvard.